When I was maybe 10, a friend and I were walking on a road near the river when we spotted a tipped-over canoe. Having been in the fairly shallow river many times before, we didn't think twice about stepping in to push the canoe up and out. But just as I leveraged the ground, it seemed to disappear. I was sucked down into a pit and tumbled around like a rag doll, only to be spit back out maybe 20 feet downstream and sucked under again. This happened over and over as my friend was running alongside to try and get a hold of me. Luckily, I was being shot to the surface often enough to get a little air before going back under. He eventually reached me with a branch, and I was able to get out. We didn't make a second attempt on the canoe, and I didn't tell anyone about the experience for fear of getting into trouble. But a few days later, we learnt that an elderly couple had drowned while camping just upstream. Their canoe tipped over, and the undertow took care of the rest. I was nearly killed trying to get the same canoe that had just killed 2 other people. I'm a pretty avid backpacker in the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes I'll hike for days on end without seeing another person. I think it's exhilarating, being completely alone. There's really no feeling like it. You get used to it, but personally I can never help but be on edge. The environment is completely serene and friendly, but there's a constant feeling in the back of your mind. It's hard to put your finger on it. Most of the time you'll be chugging along, comfortable in your mind. But when you stop for rest or to fill up with water, you can't help but look over your shoulder. Nothing bothers me out much in the woods. I've run into brown bears, had elk trample through camps late at night and much more. But one night was different. I was on a deep backwoods hike in the late fall of the season. It was pretty cold, but the snow hadn't quite started falling yet. I like that. In fact, I usually plan my trips this way. The forest ranger I spoke to when I was organizing the trip said I was the only hiker she knew of who'd be up there at that time. I was using dispersed camping sites so far off the beaten path they didn't have fire pits. That night was 5 or 6 miles from the trail into the area. I set up camp at a site about 100 yards from a stream, close enough that a faint babbling was audible. I lit a fire, cooked dinner, read for a while, and was settling down to sleep. I lay listening for a while to the sounds of the woods and the creek. Just as I was nodding off, I think I hear voices. Nothing distinct, no clear words, but clearly a group of people were having a good time, laughing, maybe telling a story around a campfire. A feeling of dread came over me. I thought I shouldn't leave the tent. Fear like I've never felt engulfed me. All the hairs on my arms and legs and on the back of my neck stood on end. I lay there for a while in a panic, the voices carrying on laughing indistinctly. After a while they receded into the background noise. I still didn't leave the tent. I was too afraid. The next morning, after a very short night's sleep, I searched the surrounding area and the path to the site. A few shoe prints I found were faded and worn around the edges, too old and too few to be from the size of the group I heard. I tried to shrug it off as nerves. Maybe nervousness got the best of me, but I couldn't shake a certain tension. I made good time to the next site, the last of the trip. Looking around a little more than usual, but still no one to be seen. That site had no stream. Dry camping isn't a blast, but it's doable if you pack enough water for cooking and drinking for the night. It was a lot quieter, just the chirps of bugs and the wind rustling the trees. I cooked my dinner and stayed up a good while after dark, sitting on a log, looking at the stars, and listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to hear the voices from the night before, but there was nothing. I turned in for the night, stretching every act out. I lay there, restless for what felt like hours. Finally, calm comes over me, and then it's back. Nothing threatening or particularly scary, just the sounds of a group of 10 to 15 people having a good time, barely audible above the background noise. This time I'm calm, and there's what seems to be an internal dialogue in the back of my mind. Why not join them? Sounds like they're having fun. I'd really rather stay here. This is entirely unconscious and goes on for a while. I'd never experienced anything like this. I was worried that I'd lost it. And after a while the noises faded away into the white noise, and I felt that I was alone. The next day I packed as quickly as I could to get out of there quickly. During the day I was more at ease, like I had always been in the past. I was relieved when I got back to the car and started back home. I told the story a few times, and every time I felt a little bit of dread from the first night. I really had no reason to feel strongly about what happened. I just heard strange noises in the forest, nothing extraordinary, but I felt it. On one occasion, I told the story to my teacher who's a native. He got quiet for a minute, then said I had run into stick Indians. He said that it was good I didn't leave the tent. Stick Indians are evil and dangerous beings that prey on children and women. The look on his face was sober. He told me not to go back to that place again. These spirits are extremely aggressive and attack and kill at the slightest provocation, including even saying their Salish names, which he refused to do. Whenever the subject comes up, I get that same fear in me. As I write this, I'm thousands of miles from those sites, and my arms are still quaking. I live on a ranch in western Idaho, and every June we move cows from our property to a place on the other side of Hip Mountain. And because we don't have the trailers to drive our cattle, and because it's summer, we trail them through the BLM lands and some private property with permission. Last summer, it was business as usual. Bedrolls, teepees, and a few pack horses to haul that stuff. It's basically a long camping trip, a new place each night with the sound of cattle, and days spent with too many hours in the saddle. First 2 days always suck, but you get used to it. Anyway, the interesting bit. The third night I had to second watch and basically made sure that the cattle weren't getting too far from where we were camped. I'm about 2 hours in, 3 a.m. or so, when the cows nearest me boogered pretty bad and pushed the herd away from me. Obviously that's a bit of a problem, so I went to check it out, as you do. When I tell you that whatever the hell that thing in the sagebrush wasn't natural. It was like a person, except the arms were way too long, and the eyes were too big, and the skin was stretched in ways that were just wrong. The most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. I backed towards where we made camp, and thank God the thing didn't follow. But it was definitely watching me. I woke up my stepmom and dad, who came out with a rifle to investigate. The thing was gone when we got over, but there were some really bizarre tracks around the sagebrush, and when we rounded the cows up next morning, 2 calves were missing, and there were more of the same bizarre tracks around our camp and where the horses were. Never found any traces of the calves, and I wouldn't take watch for the rest of the drive for obvious reasons. I still have nightmares about that thing. I went camping near Solvang, California, with just myself and my 18-pound schnoodle. It was early in the season, maybe early March, and there was no one else in the campground. The campground didn't have any hosts. It was first come, first serve, pay as you stay in a Dropbox type of place. The campground was on a slope, and there were trees, but the trees were not too thick, so you could see most of the campground if you were on the upper part of the slope. Since I was alone, I picked the campground on the top right. It was a pretty remote area, so in the pitch black at night, everything was good for a few days. We went to the beach and walked, and I did a lot of droning. One day, there was this truck of about 3 guys that came to the campground, and they were shooting at trees and smoking weed and drinking. They saw me and were staring hard. I'm female and started to feel uncomfortable, so returned to my tent, and eventually they left. Later that night, at maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of an engine and bright lights. I peeked out of an air vent in the top of my tent, and all I could see was a truck parked right in front of my campsite. The high beams were on, and I couldn't see anything else because it was so blinding. The truck stayed there for about 30 seconds, and then all of a sudden the horn sounded. My poor dog who was barking started to whimper, and then shake super hard. I don't know how long they blasted the horn for, but it felt like forever, and they were revving the engine too. Eventually they hit the gas and came flying up the slope at the tent. I freaked out and ducked down and picked up my dog. They flew right by the tent, blaring the horn and yelling out the window. They drove by the campground, not on the road, but through all the campsites and through the grassy field area. I don't know how they missed the trees. They shot guns from the windows and did a couple of drive-bys and then drove away. Writing this out now, it doesn't seem very scary, but it was terrifying at the time. I didn't know if they were going to come in and kill me or rape me. I didn't know if I was going to get run over or anything. The next morning, I left. I was road tripping around and just sleeping in my car at random campsites. I came up to one night. It was near a gorge that would make for an awesome sunrise walk. I settled in. I was fast asleep when the feeling of dread snuck in. I opened my eyes to a man in traditional war paint, Aboriginal Australian, staring in my window. My heart went mad, and I got the distinct feeling of anger directed at me. He didn't want me there. I can't describe how certain I was that I was trespassing and unwelcome. I can still see his face clearly as day in my mind. I heeded his advice and moved to another campsite. I returned in daylight the next day and read the history of the gorge. It was the site of a horrible massacre where the white settlers had trapped the Aboriginals inside. No wonder he didn't want me there. Several of the countries I did work in were, and still are, the side of decade-long civil wars, insurrections and genocides that ravaged them socially, politically and economically, and structurally. Given we worked in the remote wild lands of these countries, protecting the species people pay millions for like elephants and rhinos, you'd figure that one of our biggest fears would be poaching units. Many of these units were linked to Al-Shabaab, the LRA, Al-Qaeda, and other such terror groups. Look up the Kenyan Westgate Mall massacre, and you'll see the result of money from high-end poaching. However, we were usually well-equipped and trained to handle pretty much any situation that might befall us, and we had plenty of violent and non-violent encounters under our belts. That said, the thing that made me the most nervous in many war-torn regions like Angola, Mozambique, was the potential for unexploded landmines left over from the sometimes up to 30-year civil war. I was especially nervous because we worked in very remote locations where groups like the Halo Trust, who remove mines, didn't really go as their priority as more populated centers. In some cases, we had to hire minesweeper-type vehicles to drive ahead of a column, going down unmapped roads to prevent from being blown up. I think what made me the most nervous about them is how impossible they were to spot. I had been trained to scan my surroundings for glints of equipment, i.e. scopes, guns, watches, etc. It's amazing what can give your position away to the trained eye. Tips of horns in tall grass, like Cape buffalo, that will mess you up something quick. Listen for changes in the sounds of the environment, like a sudden silence, or particular animals' alarm calls may indicate predators like people or leopards. Smells cue you in: death, campfire, cordite, and you can usually spot a puff adder before stepping on one. Mines, however, were often completely invisible, especially after 5 to 30 years in the dirt. One time, one of our guides/trainers, a former Selous scout, found one in the bush and pointed it out, and showed the 2 little metal prongs that popped ever so slightly out the dirt. You would likely never see it, until it was too late. I'd been working for about a year at this point, so wasn't green, and we were in Angola working with an organization to do some mapping, species surveying, and anti-poaching type work. We were walking along a dirt road, overgrown with scraggy shrubs and such. The nearest village was about a 4 to 5 mile walk away, and there were several amputees who had stepped on mines at some point. The country has been estimated to have up to 20 million landmines, although no one really knows. We got reckless and comfortable. Scary how easy that is to do. I was 3 back in the column, about 30 yards from our point man. He had a pair of binoculars and a rangefinder and was spotting animals for a survey we were conducting. Suddenly, he disappeared in a cloud of smoke and dust that billowed up from the ground and engulfed him with a sharp, metallic bang. The blast wasn't super powerful. Landmines are usually designed to maim, and little pebbles pelted my face. The cloud of chalky dust soon enveloped the column, and everyone hacked and coughed. Our armed unit quickly found concealment and set up behind the blast, and myself and another followed the point man's tracks to avoid setting off anything else. He laid in a crumpled heap, surrounded by charred dirt. I grabbed his web gear, look up Vietnam web gear and you'll get an idea, and drag him back out of the thick dust. The smell of explosive accelerants burnt up my nose. As I dragged him, I noticed a trail of blood coming from his legs. It looked like the scene from a horror movie where the monster has had a good bite at his victim, and there was a long trail of blood. I stopped and jumped over to his front leg. His right leg below the knee was gone. A pulverized mass of bone and singed cloth remained, blood everywhere. I immediately snatched 2 tourniquets from my belt, got them up and over the wound, cranking the first down as tightly as possible before adding the second. The point man, Sandil, screamed for the first time. He was a tough dude, but as they say, the tourniquets often hurt worse than the injury. His left leg was badly shredded too, but we stopped the bleeding with pressure bandages and wound packing. We wrapped him up tight in mylar blanket to prevent shock. We stretched him back down the road and managed to reach a rescue company via satellite phone. Within the hour, he was whisked away. He ended up getting surgery in Joburg or Cape Town, I forget which, after a long flight and a few hospital stops on the way. He lost his right leg, but his left recovered, and last I heard he was working as guide in a small private reserve in KwaZulu-Natal. Anyway, that's the reason why my girlfriend gets annoyed when I don't talk about it while we're hiking, because I'm too busy scanning for mines, poachers, predators, and other stuff that isn't there. I do an awful lot of overland and very remote camping. I'm generally not afraid of wildlife. It's the humans you encounter that are far away from everything that scare me. I like to use topographical and surveyor maps to find areas that aren't maintained anymore but hopefully had a rock-based road that we can find in the bush. And after a morning of looking for one that I was sure we could find, I ended up coming onto an overgrown path that had seen a lot of foot traffic. Tighter to get my vehicle through, but after 50 yards of bush scraping, I was on a pretty good bush road. After that, we wound up this rock and shale road towards what we were hoping was a waterfall or a hot spring near an old logging base camp. I had clocked it as 11 kilometers from the main road when we came upon an old high-lead logging crane abandoned in the bush. I'm from a logging family, so I had to get out and check it out, thus starting the short but lasting encounter with whatever it was we found up there. I was climbing on this old piece of equipment as my partner got her camera set up to shoot it when I saw what looked like a wooden pulpit a little ways down the road. It was built so a person could be standing about 10 feet off the ground with a grass clearing in front of it. A few crosses were on it. Right at the bottom of the ladder, to get on there, was a 4 by 6 inch high chain link cage, locked. That was the first thing that really caught my attention as this being abnormal. I walked around the corner a bit, and I'm standing in the front yard of a squatter shelter, completely rigged off for the grid. It had solar and was obviously being hidden from overhead surveillance. I could hear my partner asking where I was, but I simply and calmly went quickly back to the vehicle and told her what I found. As we went back towards the house to take some pictures, I heard the first of 3 shots fired from below us. Best judge for distance I had was that it filled my ears at that distance, where the sound of a gun is in front of everything else in your hearing range. We pieced out of there. I heard the second shot when we were getting in the vehicle again and after we were leaving. Obviously my partner is convinced that we're going to get raped. I'm just concentrating on getting down the hill. Eventually we kind of settled down and I concede that we're going to camp somewhere else more public that night. We decide to stop at a tourist location, very remote but still popular. She wants to go literally hug this gigantic tree. And as I'm idly grilling and minding my own, a very busted ass first gen Cherokee stops at the road near me, then very slowly drives by me, hard starting at me, and I try and act like I'm not startled by it. They stuck out like mad in something that beat up out there. I don't know for certain if they were the ones who shot at me, but absolutely in no way did I tell my partner about it. After we got back to civilization, I told our local Mounties about it and they were extremely interested in knowing every detail I could recount. A year later, I camped on a ridge opposite from where it would have been, with optics, and I found the logging equipment on the ridge, but no sign of the strange shag. I'm a 15-year-old living in Sweden. Last summer, me and my dad visited an island located in a very large lake. The island is about 5 kilometers long, and at one of the ends there's a ferry connecting the island to a mainland with a smaller town. Me and my dad were going to go camping at a spot on the opposite side of the island. The roads there go up and down quite a lot, so it was hard biking all the way, and about halfway through the roads turned to gravel roads. No one lived this far away from the small town as far as I knew. We arrived at the camping site, made food, put our tents up, and went to sleep. I can clearly remember putting the cooking utensils back in the bag before going to bed. There was a very light rainfall that night, but we slept well. Waking up in the morning, we saw that our bag with cooking stuff was opened up, and someone had clearly gone through it, and there were footprints after boots in the wet dirt. After a bit of arguing, we both agreed that none of us were up that night peeing, and I packed the cooking things. Just to clarify, our bag with cooking stuff was outside the tent under a little built-in roof, probably made for putting bags under, while our bags and sleeping stuff were inside the tent. We both were really spooked after this, and ate something simple and went back to town quickly, which wasn't very fast since the roads were really hard to travel on by bike. Who the hell was that? And what were their intentions? We didn't stick around to find out. This happened around 2 years ago while riding quads with my boyfriend. It wasn't too late at night, perhaps around 10 p.m. We were camping at our campground where we have a small trailer surrounded by other camps. In the summer it's full of kids running around and adults on golf carts, but it was late December and we were one of the few people who go up in the winter, since it gets cold and they shut the water off. The woods are a decent bit away from the actual campground. It gets pretty quiet out there, and something about the snow just makes everything quieter. I've always felt slightly uncomfortable in the woods at night. My boyfriend told me I was just a paranoid person, and I chalked it up to me reading too much creepypasta as a kid. I always felt somewhat safer since we were on a quad, and we could go pretty fast if need be. So there we are in the middle of the night enjoying a cold ride, drifting in the snow, when all of a sudden, we come to a stop. That's when I get an eerie feeling. I asked him why we stopped, and it was something along the lines of his glove or something fell off. We turned the quad and bent over, messing with something. I start looking behind me and around me, because I like to be aware of my surroundings. I look to my left and see a brown skinny tree. I mistake it as something else, but I look to the right of this scary tree and see something even taller and pale looking. I immediately avert my attention from it, being totally freaked out. I find the courage to look back, and it seems closer. At this time I wasn't wearing my glasses and was just saying it was another tree that looks a bit like a person and I'm fine. But before I can say anything to my boyfriend, he had finished whatever it was he was doing and we took off. I buried my face in the back of his jacket, too afraid to see anything else. Still having that feeling of being watched over me, I asked if we can go back to camp, and he agreed since it was so cold we could. I decided not to say anything to him, since he'd want to go back and investigate or straight up not believe me and write me off as paranoid again. I did not want to go back there at all. I figured the following day we would go back into the woods during daytime, and I would see that there was another tree that I'd never noticed before. But when we went back through, there was nothing next to the brown tree, and that was when my stomach dropped. That's also when I told him I saw something last night. He told me I should have told him, which he was right about. I should have said something but was too scared and just kept it to myself. We still go up there occasionally, not as much now due to our jobs, but I've never experienced anything else after that, and have never seen that strange shape again. My boyfriend and I were camping in Peter Lougheed Provincial Park this past summer. On the last night of our stay, I'm falling asleep, and my boyfriend tells me I've been pushing him off his side of the air mattress. I was trying to steal heat from him, as he's a human furnace, and asks me to give him some room. Sound good? We go to sleep. I wake up to him shoving me and think I'm crowding him by accident, so I move over a little. He shoves me harder, and I'm annoyed now because I already moved and I'm tired, so somewhat loudly say, "I'm moving," and he grabs and shushes me. I know something is wrong when I am awake right away. He whispers very softly, "Do you hear something?" And right away I hear the unmistakable exhaling huff of a bear right by my head. My heart is pounding, because at this point I can hear it sniffing and huffing, which is not good if you know grizzlies. My boyfriend says we need to get over to our truck and I agree. But from what I can hear, the bear is between our tent and truck. Luckily we have command start, and our truck has a very aggressive start, so when my boyfriend started the truck, I hear some crashing through the trees and we both ran to it. We drove a lap around the campground to make sure the bear hadn't gone into anyone else's sight, but we didn't see it. We slept in the truck until it was light out, and let the wildlife hotline know the area before we left. We started second-guessing ourselves because this all happened at about 1:30 a.m. But when we were packing up the tent the next day, we found coarse brown hair all over the tent where our heads were, and on the grill of the truck. I've never been so terrified and full of adrenaline in my life. Several years ago, my significant other and I had to bust a mission to a place in Apple Valley, desert kind of area in California, to these hot springs that I had camped out at. Our goal in mind was to recover this rental car that was rented in my name. My buddy had gotten stuck on a four-wheel drive only steep dirt trail. I had met the owner of these lands of the hot springs before, since he lives inside the log cabin that's built before you enter the parking area and start on the trail down to the springs. He was like a grumpy troll, mostly due to some disrespectful people who had come to his land and brought their guns to treat it like a shooting range and lit it everywhere. Keeping his demeanor in mind from the first time I met him, I told my significant other to shut up and let me do the talking, because I knew if I could get the owner to soften up, he would help me the next day find the lost vehicles so that I could tow them in with his Wrangler. We ended up getting along talking, and he invites us in the cabin and starts explaining how he came to own the grounds and how they used to be Native American lands, and is extremely energetically charged. And I have camped here once before and have felt that way without being told about the grounds. I mentioned to him that I was native myself, and he said he was too. We shared one of the same tribes and bonded over it. I then gifted him an item I kept in my car from a powwow I had attended before. He decides that he'll help me recover my car, and that we'll do it first thing in the morning. And he says I'm welcome to park my car anywhere I want, and can crash and meet later. Then in a slightly joking way he says to me, "Good luck." My car was a Scion TC, so it's a 2-door hatch, has a moon and sunroof, and if you slide the front seat up all the way and lay down the back seat, you can scrunch it in for a night of sleep. So me and my significant other find a trail to park on, maybe a mile or two away from the cabin. Next morning we wake up, pop open the trunk, and get out to take a morning pee. We both go our separate ways, and then when we get back to the car we notice a set of tracks, and started from where some of the bushes are, and stopped overlooking my back windshield and back seat windows. The tracks were one hoof print and one footprint side by side. It only led up to my car, and there was no trail of prints leading or heading away. It freaked me and my significant other out, who had also grown up on a farm and outdoors and were very familiar with most things. We had stinging eyes of pure "oh my god, something's watching us." I see the owner the same morning to get my car, and he gleefully says, "Glad to see you guys were good through the night." I never mentioned to the landowner what we had seen on the path. To this day, neither me or my significant other have any idea what it could have been. Does anyone have any idea or any experience on what this could have been? I went on a camping trip with some friends of mine in elementary school. It was chaperoned by a few adults. We went and camped out near Jefferson Memorial Cemetery, which was literally just an acre of grass situated smack in the middle of the woods. The earth was really uneven, and rumors were abound within my town as to why this was the case. That night, it was 6 of my friends and 4 male chaperones. All of them were dads of kids in the group. Anyway, we get the fire going, and one of the kids' dads tells a ghost story about Jefferson Memorial Cemetery. It was about the earth being uneven because it was a mass grave, which was dug hastily by Civil War soldiers who had set up camp in the woods for a week while on their way to Gettysburg. He said that one by one soldiers started turning up dead, mangled to death by some kind of animal. The soldiers had no way of knowing that site in the woods had been used by a coven of witches who were experimenting with black magic. They had used that location for their dark deeds so much that it became a place of bad mojo, and it attracted some kind of angry spirit dog. They couldn't get rid of it, so bound it to the cemetery area, obviously before it was a cemetery, making sure it never got out, and be free to roam the forest. And as the dead soldiers began to pile up, they resorted to digging a quick mass grave and just dumped them all in before getting the hell out. As a result, the spirits of the soldiers who reside there are so angry at their fellow soldiers' callousness, you can often hear them wailing in the night and in the trees. It was at this point in the story when the chaperone said, although you can't often tell if it's an angry soul wailing or a demon dog howling. As soon as he finished speaking these words, we heard the loudest shriek come from the woods. We all jumped and screamed. And that's when we all laughed, because we couldn't believe that we all fell for the old one of the chaperones disappears into the woods and screams at the end of the story to get the campers trick. It was awesome. It totally set the mood for the rest of the night. We were ready to commence with the camping shenanigans, but to our dismay, half an hour later, we packed up and all left in a hurry. I had always thought it was because one of the campers got too scared. I found out years later that none of the chaperones nor kids had vanished into the woods to scream at the end of the story. We left because the adults genuinely had no clue who or what was in the woods that night, screaming at us. A few winters ago, some friends and I went on a road trip in West Virginia. We decided to camp on top of Hawksbill Mountain, even though the shelter there is off limits for overnight campers. They even cemented the fireplace to discourage people. The night started off well enough, and the stars made for some decent long exposures. Eventually, the wind and cold made us all head back to the shelter to get ready to sleep. I don't remember if we were still awake or awoken by the noise. The noise was like nothing I had ever heard before, and have a hard time describing since it's been so long. The best comparison I can think of is Native American throat singing or didgeridoo mixed with some sort of beat like drums. It was very rhythmic and very terrifying. If you've ever been to the top of Hawksbill, you know there is a semi-large cliff directly in front of the shelter, and behind is all trees. The noise was coming from over the cliff, seemingly in the valley where no hikers would be, and regardless it was past midnight and pitch black. It's hard to explain, but the noise was terrifying. It was haunting and really chilled your bones. Half the group wanted to leave everything behind and sprint the maybe 1 mile trail back to the car. The other half didn't want to leave, and I think we were all too scared to move. It lasted for hours. I fell asleep after about 2 to 3 hours of this. Nothing strange happened in the morning, but we were all haunted by it. It's still the scariest thing I've ever experienced camping, and I'm extremely suspect of the supernatural. But this changed my mind a bit. Reflecting on it now, it's easy to dismiss the experience, but I and the rest of us remember being truly terrified of whatever was making that noise. I don't think it could have been the wind, as once it started it never stopped, and as I said, it was rhythmic like a song, like something playing an instrument from another world. Since then I've gone back to Hawksbill once overnight, but nothing happened. I don't know what really happened that night. I'm curious if some others have camped Hawksbill and experienced a similar event. I have a friend who is a trail ranger. Basically a ranger who can't get you in trouble. He told me about this time he was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking down hunting stands, feeders and blinds with another actual ranger. The other ranger wasn't feeling so well, so he said he was going to head back as it's a 1-hour ATV ride. My friend finishes up with the last one when he hears voices. Keep in mind, he's far off the beaten path. He calls out, and no one replied. As it was getting dark, he started to head back, and found that his ATV wouldn't start. He then noticed that the battery was not connected anymore. He connected it, and started to drive, but it wasn't going very fast. Less than a half-mile later, the whole thing died. He radioed back basically saying, "Hey guys, I need someone to come pick me up." He told him they would be able to do it in an hour. He asked if the other guy got back and they said no. He settled down and started a small fire. But before long he heard voices again. It's dark. He is not happy. The voices sounded like an argument now. Someone was angry and yelling at someone else who sounded more scared. He called out and asked if anyone needed help. The voices didn't seem to care. He guessed they had to be at least 1,000 feet away. He radioed again, and they said that they were having trouble finding what path he might be on and haven't left yet. He asked them to just get the other ranger to tell them about where they are, because he left with the iPad that had the map. They said that he still wasn't back. About 3 more minutes go by and he hears the voices start up again. He decides to walk to them, hoping that maybe they can stop being drunk and maybe have a map. He walked in their direction, but the voices seemed to be getting further as he got closer. Finally, after 20 minutes, he gave up and walked back. He got a radio call and they said the other guy was found passed out covered in vomit and was being taken to hospital, but he crossed off everywhere they found to stand, so they have a general idea of where he is. Then the radio died, and then the voices came back. Bored out of his mind, he decided to listen to what they were arguing about and picked up things like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take. I don't care. You know better," and so on. His guess was 2 hunters arguing over a kill. He then heard the one shout something intelligible, then silence, then bang, a gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that he heard nothing, just his breathing for the next half an hour until he saw ATV lights. He told the guy picking him up everything, and they called back. They had people looking for 3 hours and found nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour, a shallow grave was found in it, and a long, dead man who had clearly been shot in the face was there. It was a skeleton that was there for years. So either the argument he heard just ended with a bang and both parties went home last night, or he heard the murder of someone from years ago. On a 3-day river kayaking/camping trip, one of our campsites were occupied when we arrived on the second night. It was a weird family of 5 that said their party boat bottomed out and they'd been stuck there for days. These people had clothes drying on a line, pots full of fish guts sitting everywhere, and tons of food and trash everywhere. My group, trying to be polite, engaged in conversation with the husband. I wasn't the one talking to him, but suddenly it got quiet as the husband finished the punchline of a joke with the N-bomb. My whole group told him he needed to cut that crap out immediately. All of a sudden, the entire family grabbed some of their stuff, boarded the bottomed out boat, took off downriver with no problem. They left behind all their garbage, drying clothes, fish guts, and grandma's wheelchair, and were never seen again. To this day, my friends and I have no idea what the hell was going on that night. My girlfriend had invited me on a camping trip to Indian Boundary Campground with her family a few months ago. This campground is on the Cherokee National Forest near a city called Tellico Plains, Tennessee. The first few days of the trip went as expected. We hiked, made s'mores, and told scary stories, but little did I know that I would be in one soon. About halfway through the trip, we decided to visit the local fish hatchery. Unfortunately, when we arrived, the gates were closed, and there were signs out saying that due to COVID, they were shut. On the same bulletin board that these signs were on, there was an oddly out of place, very unsettling picture of a fish with its face cut straight open. Yes, the face was cut straight down the middle, so all that could be seen was the skeleton of the fish. There was a text on that picture and it read, "Look," but it was in some strange font, almost creepypasta kind of font. That itself wasn't too weird. I just wrote it off as someone trying to play a prank and creep tourists out. Once we realized the hatchery was closed, we decided to change our plans for the day and head to a swimming hole that my girlfriend's grandma used as a child. We arrived to a beautiful clear creek with a rope swing attached to a tree on the bank. An old lady sat in front of the tree smoking a cigarette with a rock on her lap. As my girlfriend and I approached the creek, we greeted the old woman, who seemed quite friendly, and that's when I noticed that she was using another smaller rock to etch something onto the larger rock that was on her lap. She eventually left the creek side, retreating to her camper, which was about 50 feet from the other side of the creek, and joined her husband. They both then sat outside their camper in lawn chairs facing the creek, and it seemed as though they had just watched us from a distance for a good while. I didn't think too much of it. Sure, it was creepy, but they were just some harmless old people. Then I looked at my rock. That the woman had been writing on. The word look was carved into it, and I just about crapped myself. Nothing else strange happened throughout the rest of the trip, but to this day it still boggles my mind. I have no way of explaining these events and still haven't heard of anyone with similar experiences. But damn, the woods are creepy. While visiting a few friends in Seattle, we decided to have a bonfire along the Putrid Sound late at night. We first arrived to tons of police and firefighters. Apparently a fight had ended badly amongst the transient folk. We wait it out and get some food until it all clears. It's 3 in the morning by the time we make it back, and started a fire by the water. Perfect, no one around. While we're at our fire, in the woods that's running along the edge of the water, come a few transient people. They ask to join our fire. Loud, drunk, tweaked out, and smelly, they start vomiting out stupid transient words. It's cold, we're friendly, and what harm are they? As they babble on, we start noticing small details, like the girl had fresh cuts all over her arms and one along her neck. Also signs of faint bruising starting to form on her face. I can't go into better detail, but long story short, the girl and her weak boyfriend started bragging about their transient fight that ends with them kicking in some girl's head. We get smart, have a few sidebar whisper conversations and shared expressions to formulate a plan. Basically, we acted impressed and friendly, and we built the fire up big, and we say, stay warm, we're gonna get going. As soon as we walk away, we call the cops and let them know the 2 tweakers are staying warm and tweaked next to our big friendly fire. Driving away from the parking lot, we see 3 cop cars with lights heading off in the opposite direction. Long story short, we were sharing a bonfire with possible murderers. My friends and I went canoe camping in a new provincial park. We had this neat trip planned. We'd get flown into the middle of the park with our canoes and canoe our way out over the course of the week. First night, everything is pretty normal and cool. Next day, we go over to the head of the trail up a mountain. Mountain is a bit of a misnomer. It's Ontario, so our mountains are pretty small. The base of the trail is in a campsite. We get out of our canoes and go up to the campsite to find the trail. The campsite is a wreck, like clothes tossed all around in the mud, a dehydrated meal that someone clearly hacked into with a knife barely eaten, snack wrappers and trash, a couple of pairs of shoes, 3 different tarps torn down and muddy, a sleeping bag, I think, things you wouldn't expect to be left behind even with the messiest of campers. No sign of anyone around, but plenty of evidence that there had been at least 3 to 5 people here. No signs of canoeing. Keep in mind, this is a lake you can only access via several days of hiking and or canoeing via plane. To this day, we don't know what happened there. It was a week before we got out of the park ourselves, and we were in a rough state when we did. It was a very rainy trip, so we never really found out what had happened. Some members of our party said they saw a canoe at the site the previous night, because they wanted to be at the site, but it had been occupied. But we woke up hella early and didn't see anything leave. Our best guess is still that someone had an emergency, maybe hypothermia. It was really rainy and they called out an emergency rescue, and in their haste, left the majority of their stuff behind. I want to start by saying that I've never been a superstitious person. I'm not religious and have never believed in ghosts nor spirits. I study physics and have always been a skeptic, which is what makes this story, for me at least, the more weirder. I was a freshman in college and I was going camping with some new people that I had just met. We were going to a mountain where I had been camping many times before. We get there at 1 p.m, set up camp, and it slowly gets dark, and I get more and more drunk, but not too drunk. At this point, we're all gathered around the fire playing charades, but it's around 10 p.m. Our campsite is among the trees, and there's a large hill about 20 feet behind us. I have to pee, so I get up and start walking up the hill so that I can pee on the other side of it. The moon is nearly full, and I can see perfectly fine. I get to the top hill and begin to walk down the other side, which is a grassy clearing that meets up with the tree line. Now, right as I'm pulling my pants down, I look at the tree line and freeze because there was a figure standing there 20 feet away from me. At this point, I'm so drunk that things are spinning, but I realize what I'm seeing is not normal, and I get a grip. I try and look at it, and this is what I remember. It was standing on two legs, its entire body was white, and it was definitely facing me and looking at me, but I couldn't see its face exactly. It had a large head. It was so white that it was almost glowing in the moonlight. I honestly don't know how long I stood there and stared at it, but it was a while because I was in shock. Then it turned around and returned into the forest, walking on two legs. I ran back to the fire and told everyone what happened, but didn't want to sound crazy, so I tried to be calm and nonchalant. Everyone was so drunk that we all brushed it off and forgot about it 10 minutes later. I even forgot about it until a month later when these memories hit me. It's been on my mind ever since. It has really made me question my beliefs about the unexplained. What could it have been? Has anyone ever experienced anything like this? This happened in southern Arizona. I always wanted to try the car life thing after watching so many YouTubers who live in their cars and travel around the country. I lived in Fort Lauderdale for 5 years and thought I would be stuck there, and that was it. Then the pandemic hit, and when I checked my bank account, I was paid back thousands of dollars. Before I knew it, I was packing up all my stuff, and the landlord said I could leave all my furniture, and that was fine. I'm now on the 95 heading north, laughing and actually leaving, and I couldn't believe it. I managed to get a hang of the whole car life thing and became more comfortable with stealth parking in different places and not being detected. I hadn't done any off-the-grid stuff yet, but was more comfortable by the time I reached Lake Tahoe. I was hiking and asked some guy with his dog if he knew a place where I could sleep in my car, because Tahoe seemed tricky. He said there was a place up in the mountains called Hope Valley. It sounded good, so I went. Lake Tahoe is already very high in altitude, so this was a few thousand feet higher than that. It was this past July. As I reached the area, I saw a small parking lot that was an entrance to a wildlife nature preserve. It was closed and empty, so that would do. I'm all settled in with my blankets and the sun is setting and the temperature plummets. Before I know it, it's pitch black and visibility is 0. I start to hear wolves howling, and at this point I'm game. This was the experience I wanted. It was a little creepy, but I was fine. I was living what I normally would be watching on my YouTube in my apartment before the sun went down, and then I noticed the garbage cans that were filled over 15 feet from the car at the entrance to the preserve. I finally drifted off to sleep and was awoken by something around 3 a.m. You couldn't see anything, anywhere, it was so dark, and then I heard heavy footsteps right outside my door. At this point I'm crapping myself. Then something brushes up against the car, and I'm scared and don't know what to do. I wait for a few minutes, then I open the door, run around the car as fast as I could, and got in the driver's side. I drove down the mountain and slept in a Motel 7 parking lot like a baby. Never made it through my first and only off-grid car camping adventure, and I won't forget it. The only other time that trip that something creepy happened was in Mount Shasta. I drove halfway up the mountain, parked on the side of the road, and got out and started walking in this trail. I made it about 70 yards and heard a low growl. I've never run so hard back to my car in my life. But the rest of the trip was the best hiking I've ever done in Montana. To understand my story, you have to know a tiny bit about trespassing laws here in Scotland, in that we don't have any, so long as you're respectful and non-destructive. You can walk over any hills you like, and in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing, so long as once you leave the area, it's left how you found it. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year with a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at the time, which was a bit of a logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. Actually, we weren't the only ones. There were always yachts bobbing just off the shores with people in them, and other campers lining up and down the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene. It was very much an informal family holiday spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers installed nearby. Even though this was the middle of nowhere, I guess the local council must have figured it out and got sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip up in spring 2011. I'm really bad with time, but I know this because I got my dog in winter of 2010, after picking her out that November from the shelter as a birthday gift from me to me, as I had paid her adoption fee. I called her Parmesan. I decided to name her Parmesan, and she came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dogfighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is exactly, but my best guess is a Lurcher/Staffy mix. She is a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people, and most dogs, but you absolutely do not threaten her, because she will have you. So by the time this camping trip came around, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before, but as far as my entire family were concerned, dogs go on camping trips. So when we all piled into the car, she came too. Unusually though, none of the family friends could make it, so it was only me, my sister, my mum and dad. I didn't mind. I wasn't that attached to the other kids anyway. I'd rather play with my dog, and I'd still have my sister. The drive took the best part of 6 hours, and because we left a bit late, although I don't remember why we left later than normal, we arrived around sunset, which isn't the best time to be building a tent, but we'd expected to arrive to other campers already set up and to beach-illuminated campfires, but this time the beach was empty. In spite of this, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build the tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car, or they were pointing a flashlight at the sand to see properly. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan to get out. It was pretty hot that time of year, and I wanted her to have air. Always got to be looking out for my little furry homie. As we're fumbling around in the dark on a beach in the middle of nowhere, it's pretty spooky. The one road that led to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big O shape if you felt like it. I was complaining, as kids do, about being tired. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent to the sand, my mum asked him, had he seen the car drive around? It had been a few times. My dad shrugged her off. He's sort of like that. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes a car pulled up next to ours on the road and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low except for the torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else here at this point, and I think my mum said it must be the security. I don't know why a random beach would have security. I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust or something, as they do occasionally come down to do a nosy. The guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been high, drunk, or both, because he had that stagger to him. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool. A junkie. Not an unsafe find, but it's rare to see them in the wild. As he walked into the flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches, although I was small at the time, so perhaps my sense of scale was a little off. I don't like my dad, but credit to him, once he saw this, he got up immediately, holding onto the camping mallet, and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us that we can't camp here, and he was just letting us know. My dad tried to initially be a bit low-key with the guy and told him that it was fine, we'd leave, but this didn't work. He kept coming closer to us, so my dad started shouting at the man to keep back. My sister and I were now crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in this situation. It really did seem like the guy and my dad were going to fight, and I'm going to be honest, I didn't fancy my dad's chances. While it's grim to consider, I was absolutely convinced he would have killed my dad, and possibly us as well, once he was done, as I didn't think my mother would have had the common sense to run with us. I love her, but she's always put Dad in her relationship with him above us. This isn't how it went down. A bolt from the black like a wolf descending upon its prey took us all by surprise, most of all the man with the knife. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator, large canines representing nature. She got him good by the arm and clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. He dropped the knife as it had been in that arm that she got him. He kicked her, he punched her, and eventually got her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand and ran back to his car and drove off. Parmesan did not follow. She stayed with us, muzzle covered in blood. As quick as we could, we gathered our things and all got back to the car, pretty shaken up about the incident. I looked her over and she was okay, but the car's window were much more open than I'd left it. We think what happened was when the shouting started, she must have put her paws on the gap I left for her, as it was an old car and had the rolly down windows, not the electric button kind. She must have been able to hit it with her paws to force it down enough to squeeze out. This is not the end of the story though. We were all pretty scared, and since we had the dog with us, we couldn't book a hotel for the night. My parents decided to just drive home so that we would all feel safe, but first had to drive into the nearest town for petrol, as they were kind of low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I'd always loved dogs, but what she'd done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town and came across a petrol station, it looked closed. My dad drove up closer to get a better look, and stuck his head out the window to get a look at the sign. My mum asked him what on earth he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. Never. My heart sank. Parked in the corner behind a van, so we hadn't seen him at first, was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the bonnet of his car using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. It looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but this was Remove. The next town over was 60 miles away. He didn't have that much petrol, we realized, as we began driving. We were going to break down. That's fine, Dad said. We had AA cover, and they would come and tow us home, or at least to somewhere acceptable for the night. Better than staying in that last town. After driving for perhaps 5 minutes, lights flashed from behind us. Another car. In fact, the same car the man had been driving. It was him, following us. He knew that we were low on petrol. The next half hour was one of the worst half hours of my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone else really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps so that they wouldn't upset us, but we weren't really little kids. We were both double digits, and we knew how dangerous the situation was. Dad turned off the radio to conserve petrol, and the man followed us for 55 miles before he peeled away onto another road. Our fuel meter was on the big red E empty for the last 10 miles, and we were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. Once we got there, we drove into a petrol station and refilled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. Sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it all the way home. Just grateful nothing worse had happened than that. After getting some sleep, my mum phoned the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened. They never got back to her after that, but apparently the woman she spoke to said they may wish to in future, as he matched the description given of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if it was actually the guy, or someone else. As I said, they never got back to her. So what's the takeaway then? Other than crazy man on the beach, let's not meet. Well, for me it's that I love Parmesan. She's still with us now, old as the hills and twice as grizzled as one of my mum's friends likes to joke. I don't know why she did what she did that day. I couldn't tell you what her thought process was. What I can tell you is that this poor puppy was born into an environment where they abused and neglected her, only to be rescued and taken to a shelter, where her mother and siblings all found homes before her. Despite how badly people had treated her, when I took her home she forgave but never forgot. I think the saying is, never trust a person who doesn't like a dog, but I always trust a dog when they don't like a person. They have a very good understanding of human body language, and I think she must have understood how much danger we were in. If you're able to, please adopt. You might find yourself in a situation like mine one day, and I promise you if you're willing to save a four-legged friend's life, they will pay you back tenfold if they're able to, without a thought for their own safety. I paid about £78 for Parmesan's adoption fee, which is a lot when you're a kid, but it chills me to the bones, knowing if I hadn't been so insistent on a dog, I might be dead. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes, interconnected with each other. Think mini Great Lakes. We had been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't really have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp and fish and live off the land for 2 weeks. We had a GPS and a sat phone to call a helicopter for pickup whenever we were done. Anyway, about a week in, we were set to canoe for a few hours to the next lake. An hour or so in, and we are at the center of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in, and the waves on the lake swelled to 2+ feet, too much for our dinky canoes. We pulled off to a random clearing on the shore and set up camp in a rush to avoid being totally thrashed by a rainstorm. We just set camp and hunkered down for the night. By the next morning it had cleared up. We started walking up to the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp, looking for a good fishing spot. What we actually found was another campsite. However, it was absolutely wrecked. Trash strewn everywhere, tent collapsed and torn, clothes on the ground. At first we were just disgusted, like who could be responsible for this, or left their food out to be eaten for bears. The more we looked around though, the weirder things seemed. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears, but the whole bag was ripped open despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, everything except the canoes was still at the campsite. Clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, like serious sets of hiking equipment, enough for 2 or 3 people. Half of it was trashed and torn open, mostly the packs, tents and clothes. The other half was totally untouched, but thrown on the ground, like someone noped the hell out of there in nothing but their long johns, ditching hundreds of dollars in gear in the process. We waited a few hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew, but they hadn't been aware of anybody else or gotten any distress calls. We eventually left everything and moved camp. Everyone was pretty upset by it, and a day or 2 later we just ended the whole trip early because it seemed like no one wanted to be out there anymore. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. First we thought it was a bear attack, but there was food left uneaten, and I've seen bear attacks on camps before, but nothing like this. Bears rip open packs and go after food, and are generally pretty easy to scare away. What sticks with me is why all their clothes and packs were still there, after half being totally destroyed and the other half be untouched. I still don't get it. I've done a lot of other hiking and camping and rafting and biking all around the country, and I've never had as strange encounter as that one. Two of my friends who are a married couple and I We're walking on my family land. It's about 170 acres and heavily wooded with both pines and hardwoods, and heavily trailed. It was dark, but my friends wanted me to take them out walking on the trail. A couple of neighbors' dogs followed us, a coonhound and a Great Pyrenees, and we walked south, then east to my camping area. We were hanging out at my camping spot when behind us, further back the trail we had come down, the dogs started acting strange. We were looking back, and they came out of the woods to our left and stood on the trail. The Great Pyrenees started growling really low and looking defensive. The coonhound's a goofball, but he was also disturbed about something. They were both looking back down the trail to the west. I immediately got quite a strange and serious feeling. It was a bit ominous. I've learned to trust my gut, which I recommend to anyone in the woods, or if around a person or animal that you feel instinctively is threatening. Anyway, I said to my friends, we better get back to the house. To get my point across, I sort of grimly added, now. Well, we were heading west on the trail and the dogs, if I remember correctly, had vacated the area. While walking, I looked back and saw my one friend, the wife, looking into the woods off the trail and stagger back a few steps, and her husband asked what was wrong. By the way, this is the area where the dogs had previously been growling at. She said, "I'll tell you when I get back. I don't want to scare Derek. He's kind of spooked easy." So we get back, and I asked what she saw. She tells us that she felt she needed to look off the trail into the trees, and she saw something halfway behind a tree looking at her. We had all worn headlamps, and she said it was pale or whitish with an oval kind of shaped head, looked like it was crouching with long limbs. She's kept stressing how skinny it was, particularly the limbs. She said it had a surprised look on its face, like it didn't expect to see us there. Myself, my friends and relatives used the trails regularly, but not at night. She said the thing was bobbing back and forth in a kind of creepy way, like moving its head behind the tree, and then swaying its head and shoulders back rhythmically to look at her. She said it didn't appear to be aggressive at the moment, but looked scared. I pulled up the famous trail cam pic of the rake or whatever it is, and she got shocked and just nodded yes. However, she made it clear that it wasn't exactly the same. The next night, I was on the back porch and heard a freaky, very, very shrill scream coming from the woods. I don't know if they're related, but I've lived in this county for most of my life, and I've never heard anything like that. This is one of the multiple things that have happened around here, but this is the only one I know involving of a creature. For reference, this is North Alabama. I grew up with camping. It is something that I love to do with people my own age. I say this because back when I was a child, I liked to play with the kids in the dirt, the sand, the creeks, etc. And when I was a teen, I liked to be with the other teens and play things like Manhunt, Capture the Flag, and King of the Hill. And now that I'm older, I enjoy chopping wood for the fire and starting it early in the cold morning for everyone before they get up, so that they can have the same fun experiences that I had while I was growing up. Whether in a scouting event, or a church event, or just a family gathering, it's all the same. A good excuse to get out of the house, out of the city and into nature. With that said, I've had some interesting experiences both when I was younger and when I was older. Here is one of them. Back when I was 6 years old, my father was the scoutmaster of the boys' program in our church, and since he went on outings a lot, I was brought along for all of the outings. It was something that I liked to do, so I looked forward to these kind of things. We would find a fun spot to put our tents, huddle them together if we were able to, brag if we found a really good spot, and often make our own respective fires in front of our own tents. My dad was pretty cool about us being noisy all night, since it was supposed to be a fun event. So we would end up doing pretty much whatever we wanted. Just needed to make sure that we had energy in the morning for the next set of rounds, or whatever it was that we were doing. Anyway, this particular time we went up into the mountains, for a couple of hours in the California mountain range, and we were hiking our way up the trail to our spot. Now, remember, I was 6 years old. Don't hold me to an adult's set of standards on judging things, but if there was a rule that we had to follow, it was to never leave the trail, since trails in the area we went by are always a straight shot and never had forks in them. It would effectively be impossible to get lost on them, but what ended up happening on this trip? Well, I don't consider myself a particularly adventurous or mischievous person, but I saw a set of boys wander off the trail because they'd found something of interest. I thought it was cool, and consequently followed. Now, at the time, I had those stupid light-up shoes that lit whenever I stepped, so I was not particularly worried about it getting dark as I ventured off the path. Again, I'm 6. The lights were terrible. They barely even lit up, but at the time I thought they were dazzling, and that they would light my way through the night. I remember very specifically which boys I saw at the time, and quite frankly it was so long ago, I don't mind using real names, as I don't want to be vague. I saw Jeremy, his brother John, as they were wandering in front of me. Jeremy, who was 14 at the time, was looking at the rocks and showing them to his brother who was 12. To me, these were older boys I could trust. So I walked over the rocky mountains, one sharp stone, one small cactus, one prickly bush, and one tri-patch of grass at a time, not giving any attention to the minor scratches, cuts, or punctures that nature was giving me as long as I was keeping up with the boys. I very specifically remember losing track of time as I was anxious to keep up with the cool kids and see what they were up to. At some point while going up the mountain, I noticed that I had lost sight of the boys, so I tried my best to move faster. The feel of the dry, peeling rocks against my hands and the slippery dirt between the unstable rocks of my shoes as I pushed up each rock and slid between each crack to go further up. Well, before I knew it, I was at the top of the mountain. There was nothing left to scale. I had totally lost sight of the boys in front of me, and what I assumed would be the best spot to look over the range to see where everyone was. But I saw nothing. Nothing but rocks, dried out plants, and pale dirt. I was lost. I was a lost child in the mountains. I remember feeling myself start to panic, but I tried to breathe calmly as I slid back down the mountain. I thought to myself, well, there's no way I can miss the trail if I just go back down, since I never made any turns. Well, the problem was that I started finding myself going back down some very unfamiliar valleys and crevices. Nothing that I remember traveling up through. I screamed as loudly as I could, for a very long time as well, but heard nothing in reply. I thought it was so strange that no one was hearing me because of how loud I was crying out. I remember having a thought that I would grow to be an old man still lost in the mountains, and that I would have to get really good at lighting fires and catching lizards until someone found me. How to make a rabbit trap, and how to skin it so that I could cook the meat. And if I was really lucky, perhaps learn how to catch something bigger. But I pushed those thoughts to the side, as I was not quite ready to quit just yet. Though the thought of me having to find some rocks to make a fire was pressuring me to do something, since it was starting to get dark. I saw the lights of my shoes a little brighter as I stepped on the rocks going back down. Then, I remembered seeing something. I saw a boy that strongly resembled Jeremy, but it was very clearly not Jeremy at the same time. Like I saw him, but I could tell he had Jeremy's body, but was not Jeremy inside the body. The aura the person gave off was very sinister. He was in terrible shape, thin, almost decaying, and smelled atrocious. "Little boy, why have you strayed off the path? Didn't your parents teach you to not stray off the path?" the teen boy asked. I was honest with him, and said that I was following some older boys that had strayed off, and that I was trying to catch them up, but I had lost sight of them, and was trying to make my way back. I explained to him the path that was supposed to be in front of us. At that point, he put his finger to his lips, hinting that I be quiet, and he began to whisper. "Small child, do you know why I am here?" "No. Are you here to hurt me?" The question was a response out of all the horror stories we told on previous camping trips of kids getting lost in the woods, and either monsters coming out to eat us, or bad guys coming to take us to an abandoned cabin where we would be chopped up into thousands of pieces and fed to pigs. "No, I'm here to prevent you to be found by someone that does want to hurt you. However, I can't explain the gritties of how I did it, but you might remember taking a different path than you did going up the mountains, right?" "Yes," I replied. I very much remembered taking an incredibly different path than what I remembered taking when I went up originally. "Well, that is because I led you a different way. Someone here wants to take you away from your family and hurt you in ways you don't want to know about. The same man took me away a long time ago too, in these mountains, and killed me. I remember how scared I was at the time, and I don't want anyone to be hurt like I was back then." The boy pointed over off in the distance and showed me where our cars were parked. My eyes widened like salad plates in relief and excitement as I realized I was no longer lost. I found the trail as well that we had originally walked along as we started. "Go to the truck, stay quiet in the bed, and hide until you hear your daddy call out for you, okay?" I replied with a simple gesture and ran off for the bed of the truck. I remember thinking to myself that it was getting cold, and since we lived in the desert, I didn't exactly dress or pack warm, but I knew that my dad knew everything about packing for camp, so I waited excitedly for him to return so that I could sit by the warm fire and sleep in the sleeping bag that I was almost certainly positive he would bring. And certainly enough, I heard footsteps running to the truck, followed by a familiar call of my name. "Mitchell!" I peeked out from the bed of the truck and saw my dad running to me. We had a mournful and grateful reunion. I was scared that he would be mad for me at leaving the truck, but to my 6-year-old astonished mind, he was not even the least bit mad at me. I was ready to be grounded, and that he would send me home right away, tell my mom what a bad kid I was, and whatnot. Goes to show you that Dad cared more about my well-being. But once again, remember I was a kid. I didn't understand these things. I remember how scared and worried he looked. It was a look I never remember seeing him have, ever, in my whole life. I walked back up the trail with my dad, this time not leaving the trail for $1 million, and walked right by my dad's side. I walked up to a spot I don't think I would ever have seen because of how tucked away it is. But the shimmering light of a campfire reassured me that things were just fine, and that the rest of the kids were there and were excited to see me, as they were all told that I was missing. Now fast forward several years, many years of camping behind me now, and I am on the total opposite end of the power pole, so to say. I'm now the scoutmaster, teaching the little rats how to make fires, how to do simple first aid, all the cool kid tricks here and there on how to live in the wilderness. I was talking to my dad on one of these trips, now that he's an old man, and I'm a man in his prime years. We got talking about the one time I got lost in the mountains. Apparently, I had it easy for the scare that day. All I had to do was endure a couple of hours by myself and thinking I would grow to be an old man in the mountains. Yeah, I know it sounds stupid. Any logical person would just go to the base of the mountain, find the nearest road, and ask to be taken to a gas station or something to make a call, as this was before cell phones. But remember, this was a small child's brain. My dad. Here's what happened to him in a nutshell. The rest of the story is from his perspective. Long story short, my dad was walking in front since he was the master of the group, and must have assumed I was tagging along with one of the boys, since they knew They were to look after me and out for me. Yeah, okay. That was a fallacy that was never repeated after this event, but my dad said he remembered looking back when they had made it to the camping spot and noticed that I wasn't there. Fear hit his gut, and his heart sank like the Titanic. It was getting dark, and his 6-year-old kid was missing somewhere in the mountains. He told me that he ran down the mountain trail, and he had found a note that he had not seen before just off the trail pinned to one of the prickly bushes, a note that scared him out of his mind. I see you left your kid unattended. I guess you won't want him that badly. I'll take him off you. My dad flipped out, ran down the trail completely disregarding the fact that he might trip on one of the many bumps along the way. He said he can almost imagine seeing me just playing with one of the bushes or rocks along the trail. But to his sad disappointment, my after-image around each corner vanished, and he kept running. He said he was more freaked out than ever, thinking he had lost me to some creep in the mountains because of negligence on his end. He eventually made it to the point where he saw the cars were parked, and lost all hope. I was gone. Someone scratched me and made me off like a bullet. He cried out my name as he ran back to the truck, getting ready to barrel down the rickety driveway down to the mountains and call the police and get everyone the heck out of there. But what he thought was just another after-image turned out to be my head as I poked up from the bed of the truck. He mentions that he didn't share about the strange note with anyone, since he figured it was just one of the boys being stupid and leaving time capsules along the path, since I had noted to him that I left the trail willingly and found my way back and waited to be found with no hint of anyone else being around. It was only logical since the mountains were extremely uninhabitable. Anyone running up and down them at match 5 trying to scratch kids, if they were even there to begin with, since it was such an intense trail to hike, was next to impossible, if not incredibly unlikely. It was much more feasible that it was just one of the kids being stupid and trying to scare everyone with a stage setup for another horror story night of, oh look, this was found along the very path that we hiked. Well, that was what my dad thought, until he had a dream last night when he talked with a kid that claimed he was abducted in the same mountain range. I'm not gonna lie to you, Robert. I thought your kid was a goner. I told him to be quiet and hide in the truck to not be seen, but the guy saw him get in the bed of the truck and was about to get him. If you had not run as fast as you did, he was going to jump out and dive into the back of the truck to get him. I guess you'd made the right choice there to run down the path as fast as you did. My dad mentioned to the person that they put a strong emphasis on the boys to travel in groups. The person replied that this was probably the reason why the other boys were not targeted throughout, and that he wished his leaders taught him to be in a group, since he was alone when he was taken. Dad said he told the person thank you for helping him out, and keeping me away from the mysterious person as long as he did. Yeah, this is the first time I could actually save someone. Everyone else I tried to help was caught. Take care of the kid for me, okay? The rest of the night after I spoke with my dad about other things, after being wide-eyed for a while, and the same for when I told him the end of the story. I really do believe that there are people out there without bodies trying to do good. I don't believe that most spirits are as the movies try to make them out to be. Some are good, valiant people fighting evil wherever they can, and thank you, whoever you were. I doubt this message will reach you, but at least the spirit of the message might make it to you sometime. Back last year in the summer, sometime around June or July, my parents and I went camping, but they allowed me to bring a friend. There were 2 tents, my friend's and mine, and then my parents'. They were close, but were more into the trees. The campsite was decently sized, One half to the right was next to another campsite, and the other side, the left, was where our tent was. That led directly into a very densely forested area. On about our third day there, it was getting super late, and we had a long day, so we all just decided to go to sleep. My friend and I weren't really chatting for hours, just random little snippets, and my friend saying that they needed to use the restroom, but didn't want to this late. Later, both of us had pointed out how weirdly quiet the forest was that night, but didn't think too much of it. After half hour, my friend and I were on the brink of falling asleep when we heard something brush against the tent. Neither of us questioned this, as we were right in the trees and it was probably a raccoon. Not too long after, we heard brushing up against the tent multiple more times, all around too, the sides, the walls, even the roof. At this point, both of us were a little freaked out, but we didn't want to use words as to not alert whatever was outside, so we just stared at each other. Luckily, the sounds eventually subsided, and we were able to drift off to sleep. The next morning when I awoke, I left the tent and sat by the fire my parents had started. I told my mum about all of the brushing against the tent, and she expressed it was probably just a raccoon. She had me convinced on that until she told me something else. My mum frequently uses the restroom and had gotten up super late last night and saw what she assumed was my friend staring down at the tent. Thinking that my friend was going to get to the bathroom before her, my mum rushed to the restroom, and when she returned, the person was gone. The thought slightly unsettled me, but I didn't question it too much, since my friend did say they needed to use the restroom previously that night. Once my friend woke up, I asked them if they did end up using the restroom after all. They told me they hadn't. I then explained to them what my mum told me, and it left both of us very unsettled. Even if my friend did get up to use the restroom, I would have known, as they'd have needed to walk over me, and I'm not a deep sleeper whatsoever. Nothing like that ever happened any other night to our knowledge, and it still freaks me out, just thinking about it. I was hiking the Hoh rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington back in '03. I was trying to do this really snazzy hike, from the ocean to Mount Olympus. Well, day 1 is a blast, get everything accomplished. Day 2, fog, as thick as anything as you can imagine. I can't even get a decent GPS fix, so I'm pretty much blind. But I know if I follow the Hoh River upstream, I'll get to one of the campsites I'm going for. The day goes by and the fog isn't clearing up at all. I get to a fairly big clearing and set up my tent. I grab a power bar and chill out as it starts getting to the darkest black I've ever experienced. I'm seriously a bit unnerved at the whole thing. Not scared as much as just anxious. But about 2 in the morning, I start hearing this huffing noise like Darth Vader without the helmet on. My imagination starts to go freaky and I reach for my flashlight. I pull the drawstring on my tent a little, very quietly, and poke my head out. Still dark as death, and I hear the noise coming from maybe 5 feet to my right. At this point, I'm seriously rethinking my belief in Sasquatch. I poke my flashlight out and turn it on. I'm on my feet away from a massive Roosevelt elk who'd lost his way in the dark too. He sees the flashlight and bolts the other way, tags a tree, and knocks himself clean out. I laid in the tent until I hear a groan, a bunch of commotion, and the big guy grunt away. Summer of 2013. I'm 21 and just finished my junior year in college. It's the second week of August, and a group of my friends and I go on an 8-day camping trip. There are 7 of us in total, 4 guys, 3 girls. We're camping in a semi-remote campground in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. It was a large campground, but very few other campers were there. There were a few filled sites near the front of the campground, but we purposefully requested a site off in the back corner, and we were completely by ourselves. During the trip, we planned a white water rafting trip for one of the days. We were hiking Mount Washington towards the end of the trip and thought maybe we'd do 1 to 2 other small hikes with 1 to 2 days of just chilling by the lakes at the campground. We also planned on doing plenty of drinking during the evening. The first few days of the trip are fantastic. White water rafting was a blast. Everything is going great. So it's the evening of our third day. We have a roaring fire going and we're all just hanging out at the campsite, drinking and messing around. It was around 9:30 when a disheveled looking man walks past our site. His clothes are kind of torn/worn out with messy tangled hair and he looks maybe in his mid-40s. This isn't weird though. We all just think it's another camper doing a late evening stroll around the campground. About an hour and a half later we see this same man walk past our site in the same direction. This time he's walking slower, almost with a bit of a limp. We're all pretty drunk at this point. I think one of us might have yelled something out at him, but he just ignored us and kept walking. Hardly strange, but still it's probably just someone who wanted to take a long walk. We wrap it up for the night at around 1:30 to 2. The fire is dying down and we head back to our tent. I usually love sleeping while camping. I find it extremely peaceful, but for some reason I was having trouble sleeping this night. I get up to take a leak in the woods, and when I do I see a faint light maybe 50 to 70 yards ahead of me in the woods. It looks like a dim flashlight or something similar, and I decided I wanted to investigate. I go back to the tent, and one of my other buddies is still awake, so I tell him about it. We get up to investigate, and when we do the light is no longer on. Feeling a little unnerved, I shine my flashlight around the woods a bit, but don't see anything. So decide maybe my eyes were playing a trick on me before I headed back to bed. Sometime later that night, I wake up to a terrifying scream. It was Sarah, one of the girls we were camping with. I jump out of my tent as quickly as possible and nearly run into her as she was running back into our site. She's still screaming. She screams that there was a man standing in the middle of the woods. Now our whole party is awake and freaking the hell out. I try to calm Sarah down enough just to get her to explain what happened. She says she went to pee in the woods and saw the man from earlier just standing about 15 feet from her, not moving like a statue. We're all freaked out, yelling, screaming, making a giant commotion. I internally freak out too, but try to calm everyone else down so that we can actually do something. We obviously decide to get the hell out of there and frantically take down our tents, basically just ripping the poles out and everything back into our cars and speed out of there. It's around 4 a.m. and we're in 2 separate cars and decide to just drive away from the campsite and clear our heads. Eventually at around 5:30, we find a small diner that's open and decide to head in for some breakfast. We all have different theories about what the hell just happened. Some of us think we simply ran into a homeless guy who was camping out in the woods and was either surprised by us. Maybe some of the girls think he was purposefully stalking us. Either way, obviously none of us are comfortable staying at the campground again. I headed back to the front desk of the campground with 2 of the guys. We explained what happened, and the guys at the front desk actually seemed to believe us, but said there were definitely no other campers currently that fit the description of the guy. They were insanely nice about it though, and actually refunded me the remainder of our stay, which astonished me. As a group we decided screw it. We weren't letting one freaky guy ruin our trip, so we found another campground a good ways away to stay in. Fast forward 2 days, we're hiking Mount Washington. We get up real early and get to the mountain around 7:30 to start hiking up. We're a little over halfway up the mountain when we see the very same guy hiking down, though this time he looks much better. His hair isn't crazy, his hiking clothes are relatively clean, and we're all just frozen. A few of us let out a surprised scream. He just strolls past us with a massive grin. Luckily there are enough hikers nearby that nothing could really happen. We decided to continue hiking up anyway, since he's heading in the opposite direction, and hoped we'd never encounter him again. We did finish the hike and fortunately didn't see him. After that, we did decide to cut the trip a few days short. Looking back on it now, we've all come to the conclusion we were likely being stalked in some way. If it was just some homeless guy in the woods near the campground, what the hell is he doing hiking down Mount Washington a few days later? It's a pretty unnerving and bizarre experience for sure. I was hiking/backpacking with two friends in Montana. We were probably 5 miles from the nearest paved road and had hiked around 2 miles from the end of the dirt road. The spot isn't well traveled and is quite nondescript, but we all enjoyed getting away from any crowds and being out relatively alone, so we always gravitated to areas like this for backcountry camping. We built a fire and hung out, then piled into our tent. All is normal, and we hadn't seen a soul or any recent sign of people since we left the paved road. I was having some trouble sleeping, and was sort of just laying there for maybe 30 minutes, and both my buddies were passed out. That's when it got weird. I heard from my side of the tent a murmuring, which I was certain was a person making sounds underneath their breath. Didn't sound like real words, but almost like someone drunk and mumbling gibberish. My first thought was one of my buddies sleep talking, but I listened closer, and it was definitely coming from outside. I woke up my friend closest to me, and he woke up with a, "What?" a little irritated, and at that moment the muttering stopped. I shooed him away and whispered to him what I'd heard. He waited a second, and it started up again, but seemed closer this time. He heard it too, but we didn't even hear any sound of movement. I can still hear the voice, and it really messes with me 10 years later. He gave me a, "What the hell?" kind of look, and proceeds to gesture that he's going to unzip the door to see what's outside. Right as he starts moving the zipper, we hear what sounds like someone taking a huge gasp of air before diving into a pool, seemingly from what was the opposite side of the tent that we heard the original muttering from. We both froze for a second before he pushed his flashlight out and looked in the direction and screamed, "Who's out there?" We didn't see anything, and never heard a single twig or any other sound of movement. By this time my other friend had woken up, and we were still freaking out. We told him what was up, and all took our lights out to see what the hell that was. We saw absolutely nothing at all. We were both up for a while longer after, while the sleeping friend was out again, fairly shortly thereafter. We didn't hear another odd sound at all, and in the morning there was no sign anyone had been there. We cut our trip to just the night and moved back to a campground the following day. We still have no idea who or what was outside our tent. The only thing that would make even a semblance of sense was an owl, or bat, or another bird. But I've spent many nights outdoors in that habitat, and I'm familiar with these noises. This was entirely different, and in my opinion didn't come from any animal I'm aware of, and still gives me chills just thinking about it. My 2 dogs and I, and my now fiancé, drove a long way to get to our campsite in the Ozarks. Barkshed Recreational Area to be exact, and it's west of Mountain View, Arkansas. We drove all day, Wednesday, May 19th, to get to our campsite and set up by dark. We are completely alone at the campground. It's the middle of the week, and the week before Memorial Day. And the camp we chose is a recreational area, which means no electronic hookups, water, or bathrooms, and definitely no camp staff. As we're setting up, I hear this bass-like rhythmic noise that I'm only noticing in my subconscious. I don't know why, but I'm feeling like something is wrong. He and I kept setting up our otherwise perfect campsite until I noticed both our dogs staring across the small mountain river and into the forest beyond it. Then I asked myself, haven't I been hearing this strange noise coming from that direction? And now they hear it too? I asked my boyfriend to stop rattling tent stakes and lend his ear to this noise. He hears it, and the dogs are even more alerted to it since all other noises, including literally all of the bugs, frogs and birds, not to mention our own unpacking noises and us chanting, have ceased. At first we write it off. It must be some new mountain noise that we just aren't accustomed to, as we live in a relatively flat region of the country, and my boyfriend says that it could be the rocks settling. I didn't think that was quite right, but I'm not about to go investigate in dusk in bear country before camp is set up. As we're putting the final touches up, like rugs and some solar string lights for the nights to come, the noise gets louder. I would say they were almost comprehensible. They weren't just a bassy noise anymore. The noise had bass, but it wasn't just bass. It's almost articulated, like it was making nonsensical syllables, then pausing and making more. It got closer and closer, like it was coming towards the edge of the small river opposite us, and I swear on everything I love that it was talking in some strange static, like you were stopped by your car with busted speakers at a stoplight, and they were blaring goth trap music. Just the talking part though. And with your windows up, no music, just loud, muffled mumbling and static. I really hope that makes sense. The description isn't the best. I had a hard time not telling my boyfriend that we should just go. We had both heard it as well as the dogs, but it quickly got further and then went away almost completely. So we decided to zip ourselves up in the tent and try to sleep. I woke up many times during the first night to my female dog trembling and growling, and then I strained and listened. I could hear that same muffled bass noise in the distance once again. I did manage to sleep a few hours that first night and morning, thankfully. The following 3 nights were completely normal. They were filled with sounds of tree frogs, bullfrogs, whippoorwills, cicadas and owls, just like you'd imagine from the mountains at night. On Friday night we got a couple of neighbor campers with us, and even more on Saturday. My boyfriend also proposed in the middle of a shallow river on our big 18-mile hike. And of course I said yes. Other than that strange ominous noise that accompanied us on our first night, it was the best trip I could have ever asked for. I'm just wondering if anyone here might have a rational answer to what that was. A number of years ago, I was in the northern end of British Columbia, in the islands out by Port Hardy. I set up camp right by the ocean close to the shore. Did the normal catch of fish, cook it for dinner on the campfire thing perfectly easily. A few hours pass and it's getting dark. I climb into the tent and fall asleep quickly. But I get awoken by extremely heavy breathing on the beach from something big, in the area of my fire. But the tide was in now, so the waves would have covered it. My first thought is bear. But on the island where I was, bear was not common enough at all to the point where there hadn't been one documented ever. This is blasting through my mind, but then the urban tales of Bigfoot run through my mind. At this point, I'm thinking there's no such thing as Bigfoot, so what the hell is it? I gained the courage to open my tent, shine my flashlight around but didn't see anything, so I get out of it. I'm shining my light around when I hear it again. This huge breath, but followed by a small splash. I focus my light on the beach where I see a massive orca rolling around on the kelp right about where my fire was. This behemoth of a marine animal scared the living hell out of me, but it turned into being one of the most amazing events I've ever witnessed, as I sat watching this massive animal rolling and playing yards from me. I noticed more of them just offshore, bobbing there, probably half asleep. Needless to say, I didn't sleep until after they left. An old guiding buddy of mine told me this story, and while I wasn't there myself, this happy-go-lucky hyper fella got real pale and quiet while telling it. He would only tell it to me in the daytime, after weeks of badgering. And it was the only time I'd seen him scared in all the months we'd spent leading groups around Appalachia. I've been meaning to share this for a while. He calls it the Gizmo story. My friend Mark went camping in a state forest in Virginia with a group of college friends. They were a small group of 4 from the outdoor rec department, experienced kids with all the necessary gear and familiar terrain. Being college kids, however, they rolled into the campsite fairly late, and decided to just car camp. Camping near the car, no hike to a separate location. It was early evening, but still before the sun had set at least. As they were unloading the car and setting up camp, two mangy fellas came out of the woods and approached them. These guys looked like they'd been living out there for quite some time. Not that there's anything wrong with that. They acted very odd. They wouldn't look you in the eye and seemed really twitchy, just kind of hanging around like they wanted something, like coyotes. My buddy Mark got an itchy feeling right away. The guys introduced themselves. Now, nobody I've spoken to can remember the first guy's name. It was something unremarkable, like Bill or Rick. But the second guy said his name was Gizmo. Funny name, hard to forget. So Gizmo and his friends start asking questions. Questions like, "You all fixin' to stay the night? How much food you got? When you kids supposed to head home? You got phones? Any more you plan showing up?" Well, Mark didn't like that one bit, so he started telling tales. "Yeah, there's going to be like 8 or 10 of us showing up tonight. Our parents expect us home first thing tomorrow morning. Super paranoid, ain't they? Gotta get home on time or they'll call the cops. You know, parents, am I right? Huh? You know, that sort of thing." Gizmo and company poked around the camp a little bit more and then wished the group good luck and disappeared into the backwoods. Mark and his friends joked nervously about Gizmo and his friend, but weren't worried enough to actually leave. They built a fire, cooked dinner, then cleaned and hung up the bear bag. They spent the rest of the evening hanging out around the fire, chatting and drinking. One of them had a harmonica, and by midnight they had all turned in. They had brought 2 tents, a girl's and a boy's. Well, Mark didn't feel right sleeping in the tent. He felt like someone needed to keep watch, so he lay down by the fire. Sometime later, Mark found himself awake. The fire was dying. When he opened his eyes, he couldn't see much beyond the campsite, except for one bright, burning spot. There were lights out in the woods. It bobbed along at chest height, occasionally disappearing behind the trees, sometimes pausing. Whoever it was at a good distance, maybe 100 yards out. When he told me this story, the distance was between here and that tree, so I can't be certain. He followed for a while until it went out, and he stared at the darkness for a long time until he fell asleep again. Suddenly, Mark woke up again, this time in a panic. The fire was down to embers, barely glowing, and he opened his eyes to try and see the strange light in the forest. It was back, and it was closer now. He could see it was from a lantern. He watched as the lantern carved a smoother perimeter around the campsite, occasionally going out, always reappearing a short distance away. Mark pretended to roll onto his back into sleep so that he could watch. He circled the campsite twice, getting closer every time. The strange thing is, there were no sticks breaking, no leaves crunching. Somebody, trapezing around in the dark woods that close, should have made a lot more noise. Whoever it was trying to be really quiet. Mark lay there tense and unmoving, but by the time it began its third rotation of the campsite, the lantern was so close that Mark could see a face illuminated in it. It looked like one of the fellas from earlier. He couldn't remember which one. His eyes were bugged out, scanning the campsite like a predator, and he was sweating. Then, the lantern went out. At this point, Mark woke up. He got up and started making a lot of noise, stoking the fire, packing his gear, and his watch read that it was 4:30 or so, and the sun wasn't up yet. He considered all that had happened, and made the tough call to wake up his buddies and bug out. Nobody argued when they saw his face. Like I said, this guy is a happy-go-lucky, a human golden retriever, and an experienced woodsman to boot. You'd believe him. The sun was barely starting to come up by the time they got into the car, and they were driving out, when they passed something they hadn't noticed on their way in. There was an old RV parked out in the woods, camouflaged with a mixture of earth-colored tarps and actual greenery. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence, which was also draped with camo tops and leafy boughs. The whole thing looked like a long-term hunting campsite. Mark and his friends were actually relieved. Gizmo and his friend must have been poachers, and that would explain their creepy, stalking behavior. They had been trying to scare the kids away from their hunting site, Scooby-Doo style. Still curious, they hightailed it out of there and counted their lucky stars that they weren't deer. That should have been the end of the story. The next part I don't understand. I don't know why Mark or his friends didn't tell anybody about Gizmo for a few weeks. I would have thought for sure he would have reported the poachers ASAP. He's very type A, and it's not typical for him to procrastinate or let a rule go unenforced. I don't know what his excuse was, but Gizmo and his pal were forgotten. Then one day, Mark mentions the incident to a law enforcement officer from the DNR that came and lectured at one of his classes. She actually casually questions him at first, just being polite, and then stiffens at the mention of the name Gizmo. "By any chance, do you remember the other guy's name?" she asked. "No, it was something normal, I don't remember." "God, they always say that," she replied. Turns out that a part of this woman's job was investigating the murders that occurred in Virginia's state forests. Most are body dumps for crimes that occurred elsewhere, but over the last decade a series of unsolved cases stretching all the way into West Virginia had targeted what appeared to be random unrelated campers. But when they interviewed other campers in the area around the time of the murder, they all mentioned the same uncanny details. They had been approached by an individual named Gizmo and another man whose name no one can ever remember. Camping in New Mexico in a state park, somewhere outside of Roswell. My now ex-husband and I took a road trip out to Arizona for our honeymoon. We had plans to stop in Roswell on the way back home and decided to camp at a site about half an hour outside of town. We pull up to the campsite about 1 a.m. and as we're filling out the camp registration, another car pulls up. I watch a little closer, as I was in the car waiting and see my ex greet the two other men. They chatted, he gets back in the car and tells me they were nice enough, and I noticed they had a dog in the car with them. We proceed to drive around the campsite in the dark, looking for a spot to pitch our tent. There were a lot of campers taking up spaces, and it was difficult to discern where we were allowed to set up, but eventually we settled on an area with only one other tent nearby. The other two guys drove off and had chosen a spot that looked to be more crowded, but we couldn't see them anymore from our sight. We groggily throw up our tent and crawl inside. As we're trying to sleep, we hear this strange repetitive noise, sort of like a croak. We lay awake and eventually start whispering to each other about the noise. We freaked out because we can hear whatever it is moving, but we can't quite figure out what it could be. Then we hear snarling. I quickly looked at my ex and we quiet down to listen closer. It sounds like there is a serious animal fight of some sort going on elsewhere in the site. There's snarling, growling, and then a loud yelp. Then we hear voices. First, there's a wail, like a nightmare level. Then men begin yelling at each other. Then we could hardly hear, but certainly nothing friendly is being said. Then commence more crying and wailing. My ex and I look at each other, and in our heads we think someone is being attacked by an animal. My ex has a carry permit and therefore had his gun. I grabbed his arm and said, "We should make sure those people are okay." We hop in the car, adrenaline pumping, and start looking for where the noise is coming from, and we eventually see lights from a camper and a car. The car belonged to the two guys from earlier. As we pulled up, one guy is sitting in the car with the dog, the other one is frantically tearing down their tent. A man walks across the path of our car headlights and is carrying a dead dog. I can hear a woman crying somewhere. My ex rolls up to the guy in the car who's obviously visibly shaking and asks if they're okay. The guy can't even get a real answer out. I notice the guy carrying the dead dog turning his attention back to the two guys, and I elbow my ex hard. Time to go. We get back to our site and get out of the car just in time to see a car flying down the road out of the campsite. It was the two guys and their dog hightailing it. About 3 minutes later, a truck comes flying down the road going in the same direction. We realize it was the guy from the camper/owner of the dead dog, and we decide that we want nothing to do with whatever is about to go down, so we stuff our tent into the car and the sleeping bags still inside and tent poles still together, and drive to Walmart in Roswell. Roswell, New Mexico at night is a whole other thing in itself, but needless to say we didn't really sleep that night. We pieced together that most likely we heard a dog fight that ended with the smaller dog dead and the owner extremely angry. The weird croaking noise was probably a bird, but still, who even knows? This took place around 12 years ago, and after listening to so many stories I figured I'd finally share my own. This happened to me when I was around 12, and actually had to get my brother to help recount it, as I was scared, so scared, when it happened. I was about 12, like I said, and my brother was 26 at the time. He had been serving in the US Army for several years when this happened, and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment if I remember correctly. Also of note is that he is a Green Beret, and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army's Special Forces qualification course, Robin Sage and all of that, and by then was an active duty SF Engineer Sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to mess around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness, for those familiar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly, up until the third night we were both camping out. At around 8 p.m, we had our camp set up, sitting by the fire talking about typical boy stuff, guns, girls. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream, and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet, when two guys, who looked to be in their late 20s, wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys. I got a seriously creepy vibe from them. Dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kinda hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we'd been out there, how long we were staying up, and what to me appeared like them sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours, my brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through the sleeping bag and asked if he was awake and heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to crap my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use dogs to pin them down, and then later shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward what was probably another 3 hours or so. It was 2 a.m. I had managed to sleep pretty well. After first hearing the hog hunters, when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on, and follow me quick. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing, because I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before, but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did as he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. This was a breeze for him after rucking with God knows how much weight in the army. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and the stream, and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember as we were laying there how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was, when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I look over my shoulder. My brother had his pistol, an HK USP that he gave to me a few years after this story, and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, 30 or so minutes later, had reached it. There were 5 of them, and 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers/campers, nobody who comes up on a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was scared out my mind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for around 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves, when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop. Don't look back. Stay off the trail and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what this meant, but that'll come later. I knew I could make it back because he had taught me to land nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me to not take the red filter off. He told me later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light, so it would be harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time had a rush of adrenaline, and what I think now was confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We laid there for a while longer when out of nowhere they started screaming, "Where y'all at?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me back behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, our position on top of the hill was protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times, and then they started walking back in the direction they'd come from. They got about 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency flashlights through the woods. Turns out, my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guys sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our stuff, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in his truck bed to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been, and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to do that, because I thought they would never let me camp again. Creepy rednecks in the woods? Let's not meet again, or you might get shot next time. For follow-up, we never got any definitive information on what happened to the rednecks we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy stuff happening. However, it is truly a wilderness area, and law enforcement response, if you can even reach them, would be slow. I was lucky that my brother was there and reacted so quickly. Otherwise, who knows what could have happened. We also got lucky that whatever their intentions were, they either reconsidered or lost interest. I will note that when they left our campsite, the game warden showed up pretty soon after, but I didn't see what the guys and their dogs did. If I remember correctly, they headed in a direction parallel to the stream, away from the trail, inaccessible to any kind of vehicle. Maybe the warden continued on and took another trail to try and cut them off. We waited around a half hour for him to come back, and he said there were other officers on the lookout. There are only so many paths that you could take a truck or quad bike down, so any thorough search effort would have to have been done on foot. In any case, let's never meet again. A few years back, I was backpacking with my girlfriend deep in a state park in northeast Pennsylvania. Late one night I couldn't sleep. The woods are spooky at night, and I saw a floating light. Both me and my girlfriend could see the light through the thin fabric of our tent as it floated up and down, slowly coming closer to us. I thought it was another hiker, a forest ranger, but nope, silence. I was freaking out. I verified that she could see it too, and I yelled. I even called out. It was still silent. I was too freaked out to open the zipper. The light approached from a few dozen yards away, traveling in a wave path up and down. The light made a circle around our tent, coming as close as about 3 feet. The next day at the ranger station, I asked if anyone had reported seeing floating lights, and naturally they say no. The only explanation I could believe was that I had encountered a truly unexplainable phenomenon. I was reluctant to call it a ghost or an alien. I normally don't believe in anything like that, so my mind just couldn't wrap itself around what I had seen. 2 years later, my girlfriend and I were hiking a couple of dozen miles in a different forest in northern Pennsylvania. Same tent. Late one night, I couldn't sleep again, and saw a light through the fabric of my tent. Again, I verified that both I and my girlfriend could see the light. It got closer, floating up and down just like before, when suddenly, it landed on the tent. It was at that moment I realized it was a firefly, a goddamn firefly the whole time. Sometimes fireflies don't turn off their butts for a while. Sometimes they leave their light on so they can fly around, scaring the hell out of innocent hikers. I've often wondered how many floating light orb stories could be explained away by damn fireflies. When it happened, the only person I told was my boyfriend at the time, and this is my first time telling anyone. My experience at Skull Valley Primitive Campground in Utah absolutely terrified me, and has ruined camping for me, possibly for good. I would love to get some ideas, if anyone cares to comment. Here is what happened. The summer before last, I took a road trip from my home up in Colorado to the west coast into Canada, my northernmost destination being Fernie, British Columbia. And, as I have family there, I mapped out a series of free campgrounds to stay instead of hotels. I loved camping, and it would help me stay on my budget too. My boyfriend at the time was also traveling, so we were planning to meet up in San Francisco and get to Seattle together. I was doing the first bit of the trip with just my dog, and my first planned campsite was a place called Skull Valley Primitive in Utah, owned by the Bureau of Land Management. I found the site easily. The camping spots are up a dirt hill, so I took the first site I saw, as my car is not made for off-roading. I set up my tent without any issue and changed into my hiking boots. It was so hot. I remember my poor dog had to have a cool towel down after I set up camp because he couldn't get cooled down. There were a ton of other campsites, but hardly anyone was using them. There were 2 RVs I came across parked super far away from the site, and I was definitely the only tent camper. I decided to go take a hike around before the sun was down. The campsite was adjacent to these mountains that rise out the flat ground and have what appeared to be cave dwellings carved into the face of them. I wanted to investigate, so Teddy, my dog, and I started off in that direction. And after a few minutes of walking, we hit a barbed wire fence. I didn't think twice about ducking under it and continued onwards. I just didn't think it would be a problem. Only a few yards after I'd hopped the fence, I stopped dead in my tracks. An eerie and unusual sound was coming from the direction of the cave dwellings. The best description I can give you is that it sounded like dozens of humans trying to howl like wolves, like many people pretending to be a wolf pack, and it sounded like its origin was inside the caves themselves. My dog was as spooked as I was, and had already started running back to the campsite when I turned around. The sounds continued until I was well inside the camp perimeters. The sun was almost completely set when I decided to let Teddy out for one last bathroom break. I was freaked out by what had happened and didn't want to be running around in the dark. Teddy is a dog that simply doesn't need a leash. He never is more than several feet away from me, and I don't use one. I zipped up the tent and walked him away from our sight, and then suddenly he was gone. I couldn't see or hear any sign of him. The sun had finished setting by the time I finally gave up screaming for him and returned to my tent, which had not been left alone. The tent had a broken zipper when I arrived, and my stuff was strewn about inside, though nothing was missing. I want to emphasize the fact that during this time period, I noticed there were no nature noises, no crickets, chirping, or anything at all. I felt what can only be described as complete dread, sheer terror, and I was simply petrified. I've never felt so scared in my life. In fact, I feel the same terror just writing this out. It's truly the most scared I've ever been, and will never forget it. I decided to grab my taser and keep trying to find Teddy. After a bit longer of whistling and shouting for him, I realized he was not coming back, so I headed to my tent. I used some safety pins I had to close it since the zipper was now broken, and this is where things get weirder. As I lie there, trying not to totally freak out, something started to violently shake my tent from multiple angles. I could feel it/them brushing against my feet sometimes, and the shaking was relentless. At some point several hours later, I heard my dog outside the tent and peeked out. It was him. I quickly unpinned the door and he came in. His behavior was definitely off, and he reacted to the constant shaking of our tent even more so than I did. Neither of us slept that night, and as soon as morning came we were gone. I called my now ex-boyfriend on the drive out and recounted exactly what had happened. He started to Google the area and found out that the area I had walked into was actually the site of an extremely small and impoverished Native American reservation. So his hypothesis was that they had been watching me and decided to mess with me after dark. I can believe that to some extent. It's somewhat plausible, I guess, but I doubt it. Anyway, that's my story. It was the first and last time I camped by myself during the trip, and sadly have not returned to solo camping since. I was on my first real date, backpacking with my now husband up by Mount St. Helens. We stayed over at this little shelter called Bolt Camp, which is about 5 to 6 miles off the beaten path. You can Google it. You can see some pictures of it with a downed tree that took out part of the shelter. That is the way it is when we stayed there. It's a beautiful hike. The sun was setting as we were nearing the camp. Most of it is dirt path, but there are a number of places where there are little wooden bridges. Every time we'd cross one, we'd say, "Watch out for trolls." Many of the trees had hollows at their bases, and as the sun went down, it would shine through them, creating the illusion that they were little hobbit or fairy houses with tiny fires burning at tiny hearths. As it got dark, we started seeing phosphorescent mushrooms glowing in an eerie green. It's a really neat little shelter. Dirt floor, but probably high enough for 6 people to sleep in. Sans the downed tree. I think it has since been rebuilt. The last people left a half bottle of scotch behind, which we partook of. When we left some weed and a few bottles of water behind, kind of a take-leave sort of place. Anyway, we went to sleep in the shelter. He was towards the entrance and I was towards the back. I woke up at some point, it was pitch black, and I was facing towards the back of the shelter when I saw it. It's hard to describe. It looked like a spiderweb floating through the back of the shelter, sort of geometric shaped, floating around, changing shapes and sort of flipping over and swapping end to end. I wasn't afraid of it. In fact, I really enjoyed watching it. I'm an atheist and don't believe in ghosts, but I laid there thinking that it must have been some kind of spirit. I wanted to wake him up so he could see it too, but I didn't know him that well and figured he'd think I was crazy or wouldn't be able to see it. I watched it for a few minutes, then drifted back to sleep. A few months later, we were talking about our trip, and I finally told him about it. His mouth dropped open. Apparently, the very next night after we returned, he was outside of his house having a smoke, when he saw a thing that matched that exact description floating and drifting along. It finally sort of poofed out of existence in front of a bush. In its place were glowing red eyes. It did freak him out, so he noped back to the house. We've never seen it again. Some buddies and I went camping by the lake one night. At around 1:30 a.m., we heard some rustling in the bushes, and just figured it was a rabbit or something. We went over to check it out and found nothing. At about 1:35 a.m., a huge pickup truck that was lifted and blaring loud music drove by on a dirt road, really, really slowly, shining a huge police-grade spotlight on me and my friends. The truck burnt out and kept driving. So my best friend and I decided to drive up the road and see if we spot anything unusual about the truck. We get to the main road and there are probably 7 or 8 cop cars, lights flashing and 2 or 3 ambulances. We stop to turn around, and I swear, like a damn horror film, a cop pecks on my window with his flashlight out of nowhere. He asks what we're doing, and we told him we were camping and told him about the truck. He says, "Well, you boys might want to camp somewhere else. We had a homicide here and haven't located the suspect." My friend says, "So should we be scared?" Like a damn idiot. And the cop says, and I quote, "Well, I'm not scared. But there are 20 officers here and we have guns." I said, "Yes, sir," and tore back down to the campsite. My best friend called the rest of our buddies and told them to pack up their gear and not to ask questions, and that we had to get out. We literally threw 2 fully pitched tents into the back of one of the trucks and got the hell out of there. The cops located the killer about 30 minutes later at our campsite. I was camping with family and friends up in the mountains, sharing a tent with my brother Luke and another friend called Evan. Luke, Evan and I weren't tired when everyone retreated to their tents for the night, but the fire was dimming out and we were bored, so we went into our tent to watch Adventure Time on my laptop until it died. We all passed out after a few episodes, and I woke up sometime during the night to an episode of sleep paralysis. I've had weird sleep habits and experiences every few months or so. For those who haven't had it, basically you're awake but can't move and sometimes experience auditory and visual hallucinations. I was aware of this, so I didn't have a heart attack when I started hearing shuffling noises outside my tent, which continued to get louder and closer until the fabric of the tent itself was being touched by something. My computer hadn't yet died, so I could see my surroundings in the dim light of the screen. I watched the fabric compress as something pushed against it sporadically, about 4 feet off the ground, then moved around the tent towards me. I watched 3 distinct impressions follow this creature around the side of the tent. It looked like a claw. I was terrified and filled with adrenaline, but another part of me remained calm, assuring my body it was all a dream. I couldn't do anything anyway, so my fear was pointless. But as I continued to observe in my sleep paralysis, it began to fade, and I realized I could move. No longer so convinced I was dreaming, I reached over and shoved Luke awake. I tried to get him to look to see if there was something there, but I must have sounded like I was sleep-talking because he just rolled over and went back to sleep, waving me off. Eventually the rustling stopped, and I was tired and groggy enough that I quickly fell back to sleep. In the morning I'd completely forgotten about it. That is until my brother-in-law, who was in the other tent called Dean, said to us, "It's a good thing we put the dog in the car last night. There was a bear here while we were sleeping." Dean pointed out to the tree where we'd strung up our trash so animals wouldn't get to it, and the fresh, gaping claw marks about 9 feet up the trunk. It hit me like a truck. I had seen the bear and calmly watched it test the fabric of my tent 12 inches from my face. My husband and I were camping with 2 friends in a pretty remote area deep in the mountains, on the shore of a small lake. Our first morning there, I decided to paddleboard to the other side of the lake. One thing about me, I have submechanophobia, which is a fear of submerged objects in water. It doesn't affect me too badly. I love the water, but I get the heebie-jeebies when I see sunken boats, large fallen trees, or massive boulders. Stuff like that. It gets worse when I'm alone. I do pretty okay when others are around me, and it has to be a large, clear body of water. Swimming pools, rivers, or lakes where the water isn't very clear doesn't bother me. So I go off by myself on board. The lake is one big oval, so you can basically see everything from the shoreline. However, where we had set up camp, you couldn't see the whole lake, so I quickly lost sight of my husband. I started to freak out a little bit, because I had immediately seen a large sunken tree. This is a high Sierra lake, so the water is crystal clear, but quickly turns black because of how deep it is. I told myself I was being silly, and needed to overcome my phobia. I didn't really see anything else, but I decided to stay close to the shore because usually that makes me feel better, but this lake doesn't really have a typical shoreline. It's all granite rock that quickly and steeply drops into the water. I still don't really see much in the water, but I'm really starting to panic, which is weird. I have this overwhelming feeling to go back as fast as I can, but I think I'm being dumb. I try to breathe deeply because I really want to get onto the other side, where there's a waterfall I'd like to see. So I trudge on, trying to calm myself and enjoy nature, yet still feeling like I should go back. As I'm paddling, I start to realize how alone I am. I keep looking around hoping to see a hiker, but I'm completely alone. I am trying to not think about that, because I'm almost at the waterfall and the view is gorgeous. As I get closer, I see there is an island, a large amount of granite that is fairly close to the shore. There is a single plastic chair sitting on the island, which is funny, but slightly unsettling because it's such a weird thing to see so deep in nature. I'm still freaked out, so figured if I got off board and onto the island I would feel better, because I would be on land, and my phobia would no longer bother me. As I pull my board, I start walking around trying to enjoy the view, and I just can't. I feel terrified. The waterfall is so much louder now that I'm near it, and I realize that if I were to scream, no one would hear me. My husband is probably the only person around for miles, and he can't see or hear me. I'm terrified. I keep looking around, because I have a feeling like I'm being watched. I decide I cannot take this any longer. Even if it is just my stupid irrational fear, I know I have to get back as quickly as I can. I get on my board and paddle down to the center of the lake, rather than keep it on the shore because it's quicker that way. It takes everything in me to do it. I can't shake the feeling I'm being watched, and I feel so damn vulnerable in the center of this deep, black lake. I'm shaking the whole way back, but as I'm getting closer to camp, relief sweeps through me. I get off the board and go see my husband. He happily asks me how it went, and I can't talk. He asks me if I'm okay, and I just start crying. I tell him I think my stupid phobia made me panic, even though I didn't really see anything in the water. I feel totally insane, and I'm just happy our friends aren't back from their hike to see me behaving so irrationally. We left later that day. Since then, I've become more open to the unknown. I was thinking about it, and it suddenly hit me that maybe something was going on and it wasn't just my phobia, especially because I never really saw anything that triggered it. I'm not sure if I just freaked out because I was alone, the phobia, or something else. I guess I'll never know, but I'm curious if any others have ever experienced anything like this before. I was good friends with my neighbor and his family when I was a teenager. My neighbor was a youth pastor of a local church. Apparently, someone at the church decided to do a backpacking trip to Yosemite National Park. My neighbor had never been backpacking before, and he knew I was an avid backpacker and hiker, so he begged me to go with him. I agreed and met his youth group. Geez, what a bunch of misfits. These kids were ranging from 14 to 17. I was 18 at the time, and they were poorly behaved. Some had bad attitudes, and one in particular bragged long and loud about how he'd wrestle a bear. We hiked up the mist trail into Little Yosemite Valley, which is on the backside of Half Dome. We spent the day hiking in some really nice territory. I didn't much care for my group, but the 19-year-old 5-foot female trail guide was friendly, so it wasn't a total loss. The campsite was at LYV. It's backpacker only. So the site is basically a forested area with a few felled trees which act as markers for the different campsites. It was summer, and fair weather, so we didn't bring tents. We slept out on tarps and sleeping bags, and as I was trying to bed down and go to sleep, a couple of the punks in the group thought it would be funny to lob small sticks and stones at me. I asked them to stop, but the punks just laughed and kept it up. It sufficiently pissed me off that I vowed to get even. I waited until the chatter died off, and the sounds of deep sleep breathing grew on me. The forested campground was pitch black on a new moon night, no campfires allowed, and quiet all around. The only differentiation between the blackness of the surroundings was the velvety purple of the night sky blazing with a million stars. I crept out of my sleeping bag and crawled on my hands and knees, carefully brushing the forest floor in front of me, clear of needles and twigs, which there were lots of, so that I moved without making a sound. I crawled over to the two punks who threw stones at me, and found their hiking boots and tossed their boots into the bushes, then crawled back to my sleeping bag silently, and went to sleep with a grin on my face. Sleep came quickly after that. I snapped awake sometime later, still pitch black in the inky darkness, and everything was completely and totally, eerily silent. I happened to be laying on my side when I awoke, and I awoke completely. No middle groggy ground, I just snapped awake from a dead sleep. I could see a narrow sliver of velvet night sky between the trunks of the trees, about 5 to 6 feet off the ground. Right at that moment, a shadow broke the bottom edge of that sliver of night sky. My breathing rose, and my heartbeat elevated quickly. I lay still, totally awake, staring wide awake into the darkness, straining with all my senses, listening. But there was nothing. Silence. I told myself it must have been an owl gliding through the darkness on silent wings, and closed my eyes and slowed my breathing, trying to go back to sleep. I started to drowse again, when all of a sudden, one of the backpacks in the line of backpacks that were set against the fallen marker log of our campsite starts to jingle. Well, the zippers started jingling, I froze again, trying to figure out what the heck would make those zippers jingle, as no other backpack zippers were jingling. Right then, our 19-year-old 5-foot trail guide flicks on her flashlight, 6 inches away from a brown bear's face. The bear had chomped into the backpack and was doing a full reverse tug, trying to make off with it. But the dead log had snapped limbs, and by pulling the bag, it had torn the nylon and hopelessly snagged it. It took a moment to register. There's a bear in camp 6 feet to my left. Our trail guide starts yelling at it and hitting it in the face with small stones she scooped up off the forest floor. This woke up the whole camp pretty quickly, and someone started blowing one of those ultrasonic whistles. The bear gave up, sprinted out of camp, dodging between tents and shaking its head like it had bees in its ears. It did not come back. Turns out one of the punks who had been throwing stones at me while I was trying to go to sleep left a bag of trail mix in his backpack. Dumbass. While camping overnight, me and the rest of my scout troop, most of us around 15 or 16, arrived at our campsite to find a single-man tent occupying one of the prime spots for putting up a tent. It was out of the way enough and kind of late, so we decided we would let the dude who appeared to be sleeping stay there until the morning. A few hours later, my friends and I had a very uneasy feeling about the tent, and decided to try and wake the guy up. We could see the outline of his body as the tent was really small, so we started to lightly kick his feet. When this didn't work, we started to yell and make noise, but the man was motionless. Realizing the reality of the possible situation, we went and got my dad, who grabbed another leader that was a doctor. They opened up the tent, and the doctor confirmed that the mystery man was dead. The cops came 3 hours later, and we had to guard the tent from the younger scouts, as we didn't want them to know, because they would have freaked out. It was super creepy sitting next to this dead body, with the full moon shining down on the empty desert. The police ruled it a suicide by overdose. There was a note that was left, but I am pretty sure due to the lack of cars nearby, and the dude being from out of state, and it being 20 miles into this park, that he and his friends took all the drugs the night before. Then when they all got up and noticed that one of them had died, they covered it up with a suicide note and moved the tent out of view of the road. This happened at least 11 to 12 years ago, when I was 20 and in a really bad way. I'd been messing up my life via heroin for the past year, but after lots of help, love and luck from friends and family, I was finally getting my head cleared. Almost there, above the black tar hell I'd gotten myself into. I decided to get out of the city and drove 2 hours to a smaller town in Missouri, where Google Maps told me a small campsite by water was. I knew there shouldn't be very many campers because it had just gotten cold, about 40 or so at night. Nearly there. As I'm driving down a misty morning road, just a picturesque straight 2-lane highway, there's this object lying in the road about a half-mile up. I slow my approach and can see it's this shaggy mutt just hanging out. I stopped and rolled down my window next to it. She came up, licked my hand and wagged her tail a bit. She seemed to expect something of me. She had no tag, no tattoo for Chip, as I checked later, and was just a dog with no name. Naturally, I propped open the passenger side door for her, and she was glad to hop in. So now I had this dirty but friendly companion for my little excursion. The dog with no name. The entrance to the campsite was only a half-mile further. As I suspected, there was no one around. I just dropped a 5 in the honor box and picked the site closest to the stream. I set up my tent, the same one I'd set up for years with my dad as a kid, collected some dry sticks, not too hard to do this time of year, and started a fire. The dog with no name just circled the campsite, looking content enough to sniff some leaves and roll around in the mud. I went to check out the rivulet, about 30 feet wide. It had a man-made stone dam that you could walk across. To the west was the deeper part of the river, sort of pooling at the dam, then maybe an 8-foot drop to the east into the calmer streams. Instantly I wanted to go on, cleanse myself, symbolize, baptize, whatever. I grew up Catholic, so that kind of stuff runs through my head to this day, though I'm far from religious. The dog sees me scoping it out the whole time from the campsite. I can't bring myself to do it though. I'm hugely disappointed in myself, but it's cold, it's brackish, and I don't have a towel. So I get back up, smoke cigarettes, eat hot dogs, pet the dog with no name. Night falls quickly after all this meditation, and I roll inside the tent to sleep. My buddy sleeps inside the tent next to the sleeping bag. This dog was awesome if you couldn't tell that yet. I wake up for no reason, and my main source of warmth, the dog with no name, is missing. I slide out of the tent. I guess I must have left it unzipped. And there she is, just sitting, waiting for me, in the pitch black, wagging her tail. I feel very strange, like something is happening here, and someone/thing is telling me to get back down the river and do the damn thing. We walk down the short trail together, surrounded by Missouri black. It's even colder than before, but I start to strip away, standing on the chilly stones of the dam. The dog with no name sits on the edge of the river, again just watching me. A slight wag. I'm now stark naked as can be, staring into this black pool that looks like some supernatural ink. I should mention here that I hate swimming in water that I can't see the bottom of. My fearful imagination takes over me and I freak out. In other words, I stand naked on the dam for over 10 minutes before I finally muster the balls, albeit shriveled and tiny, and say, screw it, and dive into the blackness. It was cold as hell. It was scary as hell, and when I come up for air, I was thrashing wildly back towards the dam, scrambling back onto the slick stones. I shook out my hair, and was surprised how the adrenaline helped keep me warm. As I picked up my clothes and shoes, I looked over for my buddy at the river's edge, but the dog with no name was nowhere in sight. Back up at the campsite, I'm looking around, gently whistling, that kind of thing. I'm more than awake now, so I go ahead and start another fire. Dawn is just beginning to break. I have another hot dog for breakfast and figure I might as well pack up and leave. This trip feels more than complete. As I start my car up and check my phone, there was an hour time difference between the two. This happened to fall on daylight savings time. I'm not calling it a supernatural rip in time, but it's funny that this was the night it went down on. In fact, the exact time would have been around 3 to 4 a.m. when the dog vanished. The dog never showed up again, and I never shot up heroin again. A few times in Australia, I had some really creepy experiences. This one time in the early morning, I was awoken to the sound of a really drunk guy with a thick accent yelling outside our tent for us to go back to England. I wonder how the hell he knew we were from England. Had he been watching us? Listening to us talk? He then started yelling for people to go back to Russia and Great Britain and so on. And we realized he wasn't yelling at us, he was just yelling. I think he was an Aboriginal, based on his accent. So yeah, dude, totally get why you're pissed. On one of our first nights, we arrive in this empty site with thick undergrowth, well off the beaten track. The area had been absolutely ravaged by bushfires a few years prior, but had mostly recovered. A car pulls up late at night and people get out with their flashlights. My wife and I are on edge, barely breathing, and I'm doing my best to convince her it's probably just late arrivals to calm her down, but I too am a bit nervous. Eventually the flashlights went away, and they settled down for the night. I realized in the early morning that they had done exactly what we'd done except late at night, walked around the empty campsite to find a good spot before pitching up. We learned to relax a bit more after that. One night a bunch of lads, must have been mostly 15 to 16-year-olds, with a couple of older brothers and a dad, showed up. The site was about a third full, with mostly older people and campers, but we were in a tent. The dozen or so tent pitches were in a semicircle with a basic tinned roof communal kitchen area in the middle, and these lads took over there and were drinking late into the night. The sound was like an atmosphere, so it kept us awake, and at around 1 a.m. I went over and said something like, "Hey guys, it's getting pretty late now. Would you mind doing me a massive favor and keeping the noise down a bit? Cheers." And they were respectful, like, "Yeah mate, no worries," and predictably made no effort whatsoever to keep quiet. About 20 minutes after I got back into bed, I distinctly heard one of the louder boys yell, "I'm gonna go bottle that guy and rape his wife." At this point, it's important to say that I'm not a confrontational guy, nor do I ever get in fights. I was really scared but also angry, and my wife was terrified. After about maybe another 2 hours of the noise, I grabbed my hatchet, got dressed, and walked over and put the hatchet down on the hood of the truck and walked over to their campsite, where they'd moved to, and started yelling. I think I said something like, "It's 3 in the morning, you're loud as hell and you're taking the piss, shut up and go to sleep." And to the guy who said he'd bottle me, I'm right here, right now. I'm surprised the dad/older brothers didn't say anything, but the kid just said sorry and that was it. Pretty awkward in the morning, I had to walk past them. But I just said good morning and how are you going and all that stuff and it was fine. Admittedly, I felt like Billy Badass for a while, but my wife was angry at me and said it was really stupid of me to go out and confront a large group of men like that. And she was right. And it was by far the scariest experience I've ever had while camping. Many years ago, I was living in Central California and had a lovely girlfriend. We liked the outdoors, so we'd often spend Saturday nights together outside, along a river, in a forest, up in the hills, whatever. One night, I drove us far out into the country, and we found a really nice grassy hill. We hopped a fence and hauled our wine and blankets about halfway up the hill. It was a full moon, absolutely lovely. So we drank wine and tossed off our clothes and fooled around. I was laying on my back and for some reason looked up the hill when I saw something move, breaking the plane of the hill's edge. It got bigger and bigger, until I saw the perfect, sharp silhouette of a Brahma bull, then another and another. They were silent, just staring at us. I alerted the girlfriend and she looked uphill. "We should go," she whispered, and I agreed. We quietly picked up our clothes and blankets, and as we did, the bulls charged down the hill. We sprinted naked down that grassy hill as fast as we could, threw our stuff over the fence, and hopped it as the bulls got close. To our relief, the wood fence was beheld by the bulls as impassable, even though it seemed they could probably charge right through it without a problem. We tossed our stuff in the car while the bulls stared at us in silence and drove off, still naked. Once we were clear, we laughed about it, nervous laughter. We were close to getting stomped, I'm sure. That would have been hard for the cops to explain to our families. A few times in Australia, I had some really creepy experiences. This one time in the early morning, I was awoken to the sound of a really drunk guy with a thick accent yelling outside our tent for us to go back to England. I wonder how the hell he knew we were from England. Had he been watching us? Listening to us talk? He then started yelling for people to go back to Russia and Great Britain and so on. And we realized he wasn't yelling at us, he was just yelling. I think he was an Aboriginal, based on his accent. So yeah, dude, totally get why you're pissed. On one of our first nights, we arrive in this empty site with thick undergrowth, well off the beaten track. The area had been absolutely ravaged by bushfires a few years prior, but had mostly recovered. A car pulls up late at night and people get out with their flashlights. My wife and I are on edge, barely breathing, and I'm doing my best to convince her it's probably just late arrivals to calm her down, but I too am a bit nervous. Eventually the flashlights went away, and they settled down for the night. I realized in the early morning that they had done exactly what we'd done except late at night, walked around the empty campsite to find a good spot before pitching up. We learned to relax a bit more after that. One night a bunch of lads, must have been mostly 15 to 16-year-olds, with a couple of older brothers and a dad, showed up. The site was about a third full, with mostly older people and campers, but we were in a tent. The dozen or so tent pitches were in a semicircle with a basic tinned roof communal kitchen area in the middle, and these lads took over there and were drinking late into the night. The sound was like an atmosphere, so it kept us awake, and at around 1 a.m. I went over and said something like, "Hey guys, it's getting pretty late now. Would you mind doing me a massive favor and keeping the noise down a bit? Cheers." And they were respectful, like, "Yeah mate, no worries," and predictably made no effort whatsoever to keep quiet. About 20 minutes after I got back into bed, I distinctly heard one of the louder boys yell, "I'm gonna go bottle that guy and rape his wife." At this point, it's important to say that I'm not a confrontational guy, nor do I ever get in fights. I was really scared but also angry, and my wife was terrified. After about maybe another 2 hours of the noise, I grabbed my hatchet, got dressed, and walked over and put the hatchet down on the hood of the truck and walked over to their campsite, where they'd moved to, and started yelling. I think I said something like, "It's 3 in the morning, you're loud as hell and you're taking the piss, shut up and go to sleep." And to the guy who said he'd bottle me, I'm right here, right now. I'm surprised the dad/older brothers didn't say anything, but the kid just said sorry and that was it. Pretty awkward in the morning, I had to walk past them. But I just said good morning and how are you going and all that stuff, and it was fine. Admittedly, I felt like Billy Badass for a while, but my wife was angry at me and said it was really stupid of me to go out and confront a large group of men like that. And she was right. And it was by far the scariest experience I've ever had while camping. My friends and I used to camp at this abandoned campground. I'm not sure who found it first or why, but it was free and that's all that mattered. I arrived late the first night, so I have always bunked awkwardly with several people in a tent. We just finally figured out how to arrange themselves so the guys weren't going nuts to butts when we heard it. Opera music, full orchestral accompaniment, and a beautiful, though faint, soprano voice. No one else had been in the campground when I got there. I was the last to arrive well after sundown, and there were no houses around. A river bordered one side, and a large river valley farm was on the other. It was eerily silent all night until the opera started. The second year we went there, we expected more singing, which we got, but only on the first night, which was still super creepy, but we had been expecting it. But that year we also got a campsite filled with owls. I've never seen so many owls in one place in my life. There had to have been at least a dozen of them. I felt like I was in Harry Potter. They didn't seem to be afraid of us since they lingered every single night observing us as we were making dinner. It can be unnerving to say the least. We never went back to that place, and I've honestly never been able to find it on a paper map. This means nothing, I'm crap at maps, but nonetheless, really, really weird. I used to go out into the bush a lot by myself, camping. The longest I did was a week straight. I'd go into reserve with whatever I can fit into my backpack and sleep under the stars in my swag. I'd usually find kangaroos sleeping on the ground because they'd invariably be the softest places that were trampled down the best. Tip: if you do this, make sure you separate yourself from the ground because of ticks. A simple tarp under you does the trick. The best times was that if you stayed really still, you'd wake up surrounded by kangaroos in the early morning. My girlfriend at the time decided that we should get away together because I liked camping and I could take her out. I decided that my hikes were a little rough for a beginner, so we went on a road trip down south, Pemberton, deciding to stop at a camping ground along the way. We stayed at 1 or 2 grounds that were totally homogenized. We basically camped on lawn next to a stream next to a highway for the first few nights. On the 4th night, we found a ground that was a little further into the nature and drove 2 hours down a dirt track. Along the way, there were wood signs with cute names of the campgrounds, Blossom Site, Eucalyptus Down, etc. Every site we'd gone to was taken, and it was getting dark, so we thought of turning back and renting a hotel room. When we came across a site that was open, it was simply called Goblins. We took our gear and headed off into the bush, hiked for about 30 minutes down into a gully, and came back up. The hiking trail was way overgrown. We eventually got to the campsite. It was overgrown with ferns. There was a dilapidated old stone building with plants growing through its front doors and rusty iron bars. The place obviously hadn't seen a human in years. There was a sign saying, "Closed. Please proceed back to road." There was a stream running nearby with a crumbling edge, accompanied by a chorus of frogs. I figured that the stream was eroding its bank, and the forestry people didn't want any accidents out there. So that's why they'd closed the campground. Well, it was getting pretty dark, so we said, screw it, let's set up our tents and eat some dinner. We cleared most of the site with my machete. It was all ferns that we chopped back and laid flat, and I got a fire going while my girlfriend set up the tent. The forest was like nothing I'd camped in before. Where I am from, we had gum trees. Just think your typical Australian tree. The trees in Pemberton are massive, easily over 50 meters, the biggest one's 80 plus. Standing near these, you feel like you've been shrunk down in size and are wandering in some type of fairyland. The outside air has a cold bite to it, and the night is still. Sitting down to dinner, I start to get a strange feeling that I've never gotten while camping before. Not quite being watched, but more like I was in something else's territory. Having camped with Ruse, I knew that usually you'd have to look for conscious signs of other animals to figure out what belonged to who. Scratchings, trampled bedding, scat, etc. And after a while you don't have to look so hard and just spot the signs. When I was setting up camp I didn't see anything, and I didn't recall anything that showed there were animals nearby. I tried to keep some light banter to not scare my girlfriend. I avoided the usual scary camp initiation stories that I would tell when talking to someone in the bush for the first time while trying to figure out what the feeling was. Outside of the pitiful glow of the little campfire was pitch black. My girlfriend said, "I'm feeling spooked. Is it always like this?" I admitted that it didn't. As if being conducted, every single frog went silent at once. We heard something out there in the bush. I knew what roos sound like, and it wasn't that. It was a loud crash. It sounded like a tree had been pushed over, and then lots of little independent footsteps, crushing the foliage and leaves. Maybe a tree fell and the local possums scampered? Silence. The frogs started up again. I loaded up the fire, and we retired into our tent. Multiple times during the night, we heard footsteps in the foliage, and the sound of lots of small crashes, like lots of small somethings being thrown from the top of one of the massive trees, always preceded by frogs going silent. At first, the sounds were randomly off in an easterly direction, moving slightly north, slightly south, but always coming closer. After the fire had died down, I heard the sound just outside our campsite. Now that it was closer, I could hear it better. The loud waking, like something taking big steps and crushing foliage, a kind of repeated pattern, like someone slapping their palm against the trunk of a tree. Then the sound of things falling out of the tree from above. Whatever it was, paused. I almost went outside with my flashlight and machete, but my girlfriend grabbed me tightly, and I felt her head shaking into my shoulders, saying no. After what seemed like an eternity, we heard it go north and then west. It continued doing whatever it had previously been doing, but now it was circling our tent. A few times during the night, we heard the sounds come very close, definitely inside the circle we had cleared out for the tent. When the sun came up in the morning, we got out of the tent. Our entire campsite was covered in gum nuts. They hadn't been there the night before. We had laid all the ferns flat so nothing was on top of them. Not a single nut was on our tent. They were all spaced out about 2 meters away and absolutely covered the ground. They looked like they had been arranged. We decided to hightail it out of there, coming up with theories in the car. We thought maybe the nuts might have hit the tent then bounced off and therefore equal distribution around the tent. But we hadn't heard a single nut hit our tent during the night. And trust me, neither one of us slept a wink. And how does that explain the crashing footsteps? And why did the frogs stop singing every single time? I think it's the only time I've experienced feeling this while camping. And if I ever get it again, I'm not going to stay. I can't find a logical explanation for what happened without thinking that something with intelligence and an alien purpose came within the boundary of human-marked territory without any fear that night. This happened in 2018 December, just before Christmas. Me, 2 of my lads, we were 17 at the time, and a cousin of mine who was 15 were camping in the woods at one of said friends' properties. We were there for 5 days, pretty much did all by ourselves except for water that we could hike back to the house to and grab for the day, since it was pretty impractical to get water for ourselves for 5 days, as this region is relatively dry with no water filters. We lie down pretty early, which felt rather primitive, literally when the sun set. Every night we'd hear boars around our tent and steps. Paranoia fueled it a lot, but we had bows, 2 axes and some large knives. One day though, I think this was either the last night or the one before that, we were just having a chat after dinner, like we would do often, and we heard a scream. It was pretty odd, didn't sound human, but I have no clue what animal would be doing it either, and I'd like to say that I know a fair amount about our country's fauna. The scream sounded like it had a build-up, not like a scream where you immediately hear the loudest part and then it dies and fades out, but it started low and got real intense then stopped. I'd say it was around 50 meters or so away, but then it happened again and again, now suddenly coming from more sides, and way more sides, and it was getting pretty close. It didn't sound super menacing, even though we were mad scared, shooting my airgun with no rounds to make it louder. It got to the point where the sound seemed like it was coming right from where the campfire couldn't shed any light. I remembered that we had set up some traps for rabbits down the trail that day, so we grew as many balls as we could and went there. The bait was gone, traps unarmed, and, stupid idea anyway, rabbits didn't scream like that. We had some pretty strong flashlights, but we couldn't see a thing. Suddenly, everything stopped. It was one of the most terrifying experiences I'd ever had, and every time someone asks me for a scary story, I share this one. I wish I could get some explanation on this. I'd never heard of any animal to do this, much less communally. Also, I live in Portugal. The country doesn't have any cougars or anything, which is one of the things that I could kind of think it might be. To this day, I still have no explanation. I tried getting some stuff from friends and family, 4chan, on what they think it could be, but still, I'm at a loss. Where I live, there are huge swaths of forested land that is miles and miles away from any sort of civilization. Being a good old country boy, I spent a lot of time camping along the DNR roads. One year, we were camped out on the side of a little mountain and spent the night drinking and whatnot. The next morning, nobody wanted to cook, so we decided to drive into a town 20 miles away for breakfast. As we were all exiting the forest, we came across a police blockade. The sheriffs had their automatic rifles pointed at us and told us to park the vehicle and walk towards them with our hands out in the air. We followed instructions and they told us that a forest ranger had been shot the previous night. I later found out that she was shot about 300 feet below our campsite. We probably heard the gun, but in that part it wasn't unusual for people to be shooting in the area. We were told we couldn't go back for our camp gear as the killer was still on the loose. Instead, we drove to a nearby casino and got back to the revelry. A few hours later, the gas station next to the casino was packed with sheriffs, the police department, FBI, and every law enforcement officer within 50 miles must have been there. As it turns out, the killer was spotted at the gas station, and an officer who happened to be there recognized him. When the law enforcement officer told him to get on the ground, the killer reached for his gun, at which point the law enforcement officer shot and killed him. What was so strange was that we were within a few hundred feet of where he killed someone, and hours later, a few hundred feet from where he was ultimately killed. We drove back to the campsite that night a little sombered, then proceeded to get very drunk. One time when I was younger, in 7th grade, I went on a camping trip with a close family friend as part of his birthday. In total, there were 5 kids of us, all in the same grade, and 2 adults. The birthday boy's dad and his uncles. It was going to be like a boys' weekend. Once we get to the campsite, we set up 2 tents. One large tent for all the kids to stay in, and a medium-sized tent for his dad and uncle. The first day was great. We did a bunch of activities like wood carving, canoeing, etc. And at night, his dad cooks up some burgers for everyone. And then we all went to bed, not really thinking about what the ranger said about leftovers in our way into the campground. Suddenly at around 2 a.m. I wake up because I felt a large figure rub against my body from outside the tent. It sort of woke me up. At first I didn't really think anything of it, and was planning to go back to sleep. That is until I started hearing noises like something was looking through our stuff around the campfire. Now, before the adults went to sleep, they told us not to open the tent under any circumstances, but there was a little window near the top of the tent that you could look through if you opened the flap. So I decided to take a look, assuming that it was probably a few raccoons, since we did see some on the drive into the campground. But no. To my surprise, it was something much, much bigger than a raccoon. There was a black bear eating the leftovers in the cooler. This was happening directly outside of my tent. 6 feet away max. So I was already pretty spooked, because I didn't know what to do in this situation. I wanted to wake up the other boys to tell them what was going on, but I knew if we started making too much noise, it would be a really bad idea. So instead I just quietly stared at this bear as he ate all our leftovers for a good 20 minutes. This was already not a fun situation, but while this is happening I decided to start scanning the forest behind the bear, which is when I noticed a few pairs of bright yellow eyes staring at the bear maybe 15 feet further out. So at this point I was crapping myself and decided to just close the window to go back to sleep and pray that nothing happened. Like I said before, 20 minutes later I finally stopped hearing the bear going through all our stuff. I take a peek outside the window and sure enough it's gone. The next morning we leave the tent to find a bunch of bear prints all over our campsite, with a large portion of our food having been eaten. There was also a bunch of smaller prints all over our campsite. We assumed something else came by after the bear left. In the end, the dad decided to end the camping trip early, and we went back to the city later that same day. I was camping out last fall in the Allegheny National Forest. The missus and I and the 2 dogs were at a primitive site about 100 yards away from the road. It was very late in the season, so we were literally the only people for miles. Our campsite was set up with 2 tents facing each other across the fire pit. We slept in one with the dogs, and the other we used for storage. The second night, like an idiot, I decided to leave the sealed food in the storage tent instead of tying it up or taking it to the car for overnight. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of ripping and crunching. Jerked, completely awake, mind racing, I instantly knew that something was in the storage tent, nomming on some tasty dog food or potato chips. I fumbled for a flashlight and slowly unzipped my tent fly, shined the light across the campsite to the other tent, when I saw a pair of eyes. I was expecting a raccoon. The problem was, the eyes were about 2 to 3 feet off the ground. Black, bear. A big one. I know. Intellectually, you're supposed to make noise. I know. Intellectually, that I'm not in much danger. However, being within feet of a bear at night in the pitch black, not being able to see a thing, but the sounds. The ripping, the heavy tread, the snuffing. It's truly primally terrifying. Higher thought process went right out the window. I zipped my tent back up and looked down at my wife and grabbed my log splitter and stood over her sleeping body in the tent in a defensive position, axe at the ready, in case he decided to try and get into the sleeping tent. I stood like that for a half hour in the complete darkness, just listening to the breathing, and the harumph, and the ripping, and the eating. A black bear eating potato chips at night is really crunchy and loud. He wandered around the site, even snuffling the outside of our tent. I never woke up the wife, because why subject her to this terror, I thought. Eventually, higher thought process started to leak through. The car was 50 yards away. Maybe I can run to it. Maybe I can make noise. Maybe it will go away. What was I thinking? The car. My keys were in my sleeping bag, and on those keys was an electronic fob. And on that heavenly electric fob was a button that we all thought was useless or annoying if you accidentally press it. The alarm. I smashed down the button, and the night lit up with honks and flashing lights. Sound and light crashed through the campsite, and I heard the bear take off. Then my wife woke up to see her shaking, pale-faced husband standing over her with an axe. After I calmed her down, we got out and inspected the campsite. The bear had ripped its way into the inside of the storage tent, had eaten potato chips, dog food trail mix, and had wandered around to our side to the dishwashing area, probably attracted to the smell of the dirty dishwater with meat residue in it. Still coming down from my adrenaline rush, the wife and I spent the rest of the night sleeping in the car. The bear never came back, and I learnt my lesson regarding food at a campsite. And the dogs never woke up through the whole ordeal. When I was about 12, my parents decided to take my brother and I on our first hiking/camping trip in Jasper. We've done plenty of camping and a fair amount of hiking, but we'd never done one of those hikes to the site and hike around the area type of trips before. My parents are big outdoors people, and they really enjoyed these trips and they know what they're doing. We hiked about 7 kilometers. It was a nice day, and I remember there was a river near the path we'd occasionally end up walking by, but nothing too eventful. We got to the campsite probably around 3 to 5 p.m. It was one that had a main communal eating/fire pit area and a bunch of campsites surrounding it. My brother and I stayed there while my parents went to the campsite to set up the tent. While we were sitting there, my brother came over and said really quietly, "There's a bear over there." And I looked up, and sure enough, there was a bear coming out of the bushes not too far away. My dad ran for a group of kids that thought about outdoor safety, so we knew to stay quiet and calm while we backed away and went over to our parents and said, "There's a bear over there." My mum took me and my brother far away, and my dad did what you're supposed to do. Let the bear know you're there, make a bunch of noise and scare it away. I think he even got the bear spray out, but nothing worked. Eventually, we decided to leave because the bear wasn't going to. My mum and brother had changed out of their hiking boots to Crocs, and I was the only one who still had their backpack. We had to bushwhack for a while because the bear was between us and the way to the trail, but thankfully the river helped us know where we were going. We eventually found the path and walked all the way back to the parking lot, where we called the ranger station and let them know what happened. The next day they came back with our stuff, most of it torn to shreds or with teeth marks. There was a small propane can the bear had bitten, and my mum's shoes were chewed. My brother's teddy bear decapitated and the tent destroyed. We spent the rest of the trip in a hotel and visited stores and such in Jasper, which I secretly liked better than our original plan. Let me take you back to July of 2018. I was 15 at the time. My boyfriend at the time, his older sister, her boyfriend, and one other couple wanted to go camping. My parents very reluctantly let me go, but I had an amazing time over the 2 nights. But something terrifying happened to us during that trip, which started the first night we were there. For some context, this was in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. The forests here are dense, and unless you're in a clearing, barely any moonlight can get through the thick treetops, which makes the night pretty spooky in itself. Prior to this camping trip, what usually scared me the most about these woods was the thought of cougars and bears. My boyfriend and I shared a tent on the far side of camp, and the other 2 couples had tents on the side of the camp opposite to us. After laughing and talking about the fire for a little while, my boyfriend and I decided to go into our tent. It was around 11 p.m. at this point, and we weren't ready to sleep yet. So after we spent a few hours in our tent laughing and talking, around 2 or 3 a.m., we started hearing noises around our camp. I felt a little uneasy. We both felt quiet and just listened. It sounded like 2 or 3 people passing through our campsite. There were voices that sounded like teenagers, and eventually they passed through our camp with no incident. We both breathed a sigh of relief and continued laughing and talking. At about 3:30 or 4 a.m., we started hearing noises around our tent again. This time there were no voices, only footsteps. Him and I whispered back and forth, discussing what we might be hearing. A deer, maybe? The footsteps didn't sound heavy enough to be a bear, and a cougar wouldn't be stalking our idle tents. After a while, we noticed that the footsteps weren't passing through the camp. They were circling our tent. Only ours. Slowly, my blood ran cold. Neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other. What kind of animal would do that? The footsteps soon moved on to the other tents. It sounded like whatever was circling the other 2 was doing so for a similar amount of time before moving back to ours. As we kept listening, we came to the conclusion that the footsteps sounded like boots. We knew that no animal would behave in this way. The freakiest part was that there was no flashlight in sight. If they were a person, they were walking through the woods in the witching hour, in the pitch darkness of the forest, unable to see anything. Eventually, the footsteps went away. They didn't recede, they simply were gone, like whatever was making them just suddenly vanished. We figured we were just too tired and afraid and didn't notice we heard them leaving, and soon we went to sleep. Now in Colorado, it's extremely dry for most of the summer, and in the Rocky Mountains the ground is mostly rocks and tree roots under a thin layer of dry dirt. We searched around our tent for tracks, in what little mud there was, and we found boot tracks. Everyone else in the campsite said they heard the same thing around the same time. We were all quite creeped out, but tried to convince ourselves that all was well, and that maybe someone had just been lost. The next night passed without incident, and I left the next day, a day before everyone else because my parents were making me leave a day early. But the story doesn't end there. The day after I left, everyone else on the trip was due to leave as well. As they were packing up the campsite, an elderly-looking woman walked down from the woods from a trail leading up the hill. She asked them if they were leaving. They thought this was extremely weird, because we hadn't actually seen anyone the whole time we were there. But they told her that they were in fact packing up, and she walked back up the trail and vanished behind the tree line. My boyfriend's older sister's boyfriend thought this whole encounter was suspicious, so he followed the old woman up the trail. He walked the entire trail, but the woman was gone. The trail led to a sheer cliff edge. There was no way to get down it, no way to get up it either. On either side of the trail was dense forest, no houses, roads, nothing. The old woman simply vanished. My boyfriend and I believe what we heard on the first night may have been the old woman. How else could she have known exactly where we were, unless she had already been there? The problem with this is that there was nowhere for the old woman to have gone, and nowhere that she could have come from. And what old woman would walk in circles around our tents in the middle of the night, with no flashlight? That is not only extremely dangerous for anyone to do, but creepy behavior in general. People I've spoken to about the incident believe it could have been a ghost, perhaps even a skinwalker. Me and my now ex don't talk anymore, and neither do the other two couples who went on the trip, but I'm sure they all remember this experience. That's one of the creepiest things that ever happened to them, too. There was this one time where me and my entire mum's side of the family were camping out of our state in Missouri. It was my cousin Keaton, cousin Gabby, Eli, and a friend of mine and myself. Her name was Trinity and her boyfriend Kindon. There was a part of the lake that no one was supposed to go around because there were supposedly snakes and other dangerous animals. This happened at night. We were separated into groups of 2. One of my other cousins was supposed to go with me, but decided not to because he felt a little nauseous and didn't feel good. I go with Eli without flashlight and set out east into the part of the forest we aren't supposed to explore, while the others go separate ways. About 20 minutes or so of walking straight, we smell something horrible, like rotten meat set out for weeks. I asked Eli if he knew anything about bad smells or whatever, and he didn't really know anything about it. We slowly approach the smell and see some sort of liquid trail leading to our campsite. Me and him walk towards the start of the trail and see a grown female and a baby rotting away covered in blood, each having stab wounds in the neck and stomach. Me and Eli literally scream like little girls, and were 15 and 16 at the time, and scream for help at the top of our lungs. I smelled something else though, and Eli didn't notice, but I did. I smelled like my cousin's cologne near the bodies, and boot prints that represent the bottom of my cousins. I didn't know what, so I yelled to Eli to follow the trail and go back to camp, and yell and scream for help while I stayed back and searched the woman to see if she had any ID or personal information to show the police if they arrived. I found her wallet and credit card along with some notes for her work with her name on it. I gathered these things and sprinted my ass off back to camp to tell everyone. I was brutally terrified and scared out my mind. I thought I was going to die that night. Anyway, me and Eli get there trying to calm down while Keaton and Gabby are back, but the rest are still gone. I told my aunt, 2 uncles and grandpa, and everyone else there. My uncles and dad went to check out the bodies while my aunt and everyone else called the police and ambulances. The cousin that was feeling sick smelt like manure and his boots looked wet. The police got there and handled everything, and the ambulance took the bodies out and that. My cousin is a good liar, and I talked to him about feeling scared, trying to find ways to figure out if he did it or not. Still to this day I can't figure out if he was the one who murdered that innocent mum and baby. I don't know if the police caught anyone or found further suspects, but they didn't talk to my cousin. I'm still scared to be around him to this day. And whenever I see him at family reunions, I try to avoid him. The detective that came with the cops estimated that the woman and baby started rotting anywhere between 4 hours ago. I actually thought by the way it smelled it had to be old because it couldn't possibly have been my cousin. It was just unbelievable to me. We had been camping for about 2 to 3 days at the time, and I can't remember exactly, but the professional said to us that it was very fresh and to be aware and to look out for any suspicious activity. My cousin has always had a weird personality and was the odd one out in the family. I just figured out, not even a week ago, that one of my friend's mums had a lie detector test and is a psychologist, and I might invite my cousin to use the lie detector on him about the whole incident. What do you guys think? I'm 26, and this happened when I was no more than 6 years old. See, my mum, Shannon, was a single mother working 2 jobs to take care of me and my 3 sisters, Jane, Janet, myself, Gwen, and Rita. We lived in a big city. One summer day, my mum got the idea to take us girls camping, real forest camping. No sights, no pool, real roughing it. The next week, Mum got us girls packed and ready. Early the next morning, my mum woke us up early in the morning and packed us kids into the car and set off into the mountains for a fun camping adventure. For the entirety of the drive, my elder sisters, Jane and Janet, who were 13 and 10 respectively, shared stories of legendary sightings in the forest of the fabled Sasquatch. They said he was 10 foot tall with slanted yellow eyes and big hands that grabbed at little kids who were lost in the woods. They told Rita that the beast stole kids and took them back to his cave, where he kept them in cages and munched on them whenever he got hungry. My poor little sister was only 3, and shaking in her car seat, clutching an old teddy bear, her brown eyes so wide I thought they'd pop from her tiny head. Fast forward to when we arrive at the spot. We unpack the car, set up the food, campfire and tents. That weekend was the finest I can ever remember. It was fine until the last night when I awoke in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. After I had finished, I saw eyes, yellow and slanted. I followed them further and further into the woods until I realized I was totally lost. Overhead was the moon, full and glowing brightly, but clouds were slowly moving in, covering the moon in patches. I'd heard heavy footsteps behind me. They were quick and sure, low growls surrounding me, echoing in my young ears ahead of what I saw. Those same eyes I'd followed into the deeper part of the woods. They narrowed and watched my every move as I tried to get out of its view, and then I whispered, "Are you Bigfoot? Will you eat me? Please don't, my mom will be upset." That is when I heard a low voice growl, "Go back, small one." Suddenly, there was a snapping twig to my left, and I went running until I came back to the clearing that my family was camping in. I turned once more, waving at the creature, and whispered, "I hope to see you again soon." Then went back to the tent, smiling as I curled up beside my mum and sister. I never shared the experience with any of them. I knew they would have never have believed me anyway. I was camping at the lake at the Horns of Alberta. It's about a 12-kilometer hike and 700-meter elevation to get to the lake. Most of the elevation is in the last 500 meters when you hit the headwall. We knew ahead of time that you weren't supposed to camp at the lakes, as there isn't any flat ground or tree cover. Instead, you camp below the headwall. However, for multiple reasons, we decided to camp at the lake, where we found some flat, small squares of land that we could pitch a tent, although it was like 5 meters away from the water, with no tree or even a bush to cover at all. We did this for a few reasons, because we wanted to avoid mosquitoes which had eaten us alive the night before, since we had lost our bug spray. One of our friends was new to hiking and didn't have the energy to hike back down, and it was also just an amazing view. Fast forward a few hours and the strongest winds I've ever felt in my life began pounding us. Our tent, which was pegged in and had our bags inside, got lifted off the ground and almost flew into the lake. We managed to grab it just in time, and I was holding onto the tent as everyone else was grabbing everything we had, and we're just going to sit in the tent until the winds died down. During this time we were getting absolutely soaked, a bit because of some rain, but mostly because of the wind lifting up spray from the lake. Then this one gust came and hit me so hard, I felt like I might get lifted off the ground and pushed me forward to fall onto the tent, which ripped the fly. Once the initial rip had happened, the wind tore it open and off the tent. At this point, we decided to take the tent down and pack everything in our bags, otherwise everything else would get soaked without the fly. I should mention that during all of this, I was tripping on shrooms. Thankfully, it wasn't turning into a bad trip. I was actually laughing so hard and felt the deepest sense of adventure I have ever felt in my life. Though I was quite scared, we would have to spend the night sitting on the ground getting cold and wet and no sleep, followed by an absolutely miserable hike out the next day. At this point, we could have tried to hike down to the headwell to the main campsite, but it was getting dark, windy and wet, 2 of us were tripping, and I'm glad we decided not to do this, as one of us could have easily fallen off the cliff and died in these conditions. It's sketchy enough hiking down in perfect conditions. Instead, we sat beside some bushes on the opposite side of the lake and prayed the wind would die down soon. After an hour, things had eerily calmed down, and we decided to set up the tent again, hoping that the fly would still be usable. We did everything we could to secure the fly to the tent, and it seemed like it might hold, but if another gust of wind came, it would surely rip it off, and if it rained, it would suck. Thankfully, despite some more wind in the night, during which I was lying awake praying that the fly held, it did indeed hold, and we made it through the night dry, with a few hours of sleep. My boys and I were dry camping on a plateau above one of the many canyons in the Snake River Wilderness in late summer. The first night at around 1 a.m. we saw several lights rise into the sky, what seemed to be about 10 miles away. We immediately thought it was just drones and thought nothing of it. Then we started seeing flashing amber lights reflecting off the canyon walls, so naturally my curiosity compelled me to see what was going on. We got in the truck and started driving down the only road in the area, hoping that we could get close enough to see. After about 30 minutes everything went dark and we never saw any more lights. We never did find out what it was. On the second night, we had just gotten to sleep when I was awoken by wolves howling. At that point I wasn't scared at all, just kind of fascinated by the sound. They seemed pretty far off and it was cool to listen to. I drifted back to sleep, and then some time later was awoken by the sound of running animals. I bolted upright just in time to see several animals that looked to be wolves, which was hard to tell by the moonlight through the tent screen, running past our truck. They never stopped, just ran ahead of us. It is the only time I've ever seen wolves in the wild, and it was intimidating to see just how big they really are. But even with all the excitement, that wasn't the scariest part of the night. About 2 hours after the wolf event, I had to get up to pee. I didn't even want to get out the tent, but the bladder kind of forced the issue. I worked up the courage to get up, slung my gun around my shoulder and stepped out. I was about midstream when a thud and the sound of footfalls came from the area just to my right. I spun and drew my gun, in full picnic, only to realize it was a cow rubbing against a small pine tree about 40 yards away, and have never been so relieved to see a cow in my life. Every summer my family went camping on remote campsites that were very typically islands in the middle of a lake, or a piece of edge not accessible except from water. The body of water is quite big. There are a lot of fish, but you mostly see trout and catfish in the area, nothing too big. Well, my best friend came with us this year, and all the adults were drinking by the fire at dusk. It was getting darker, but the twilight illuminated the water enough to do some fishing still. So I cast off a rock with my friend by my side. I felt a bite and started to reel it in, and it was big, the biggest fish I'd ever had on my line to date. I don't fish much, mostly for food, and was just barely able to pull the thing above water, and we were hollering at this point for my parents' help, but they were busy drinking. The fish had to have been at least 2 feet long. My fishing pole was almost bent in half, and unfortunately as I was reeling it in, my line snapped from the weight of the fish. My 60-pound rated fishing wire flung it into the tree above me and I lost my lure. We freaked out and were yelling to my family about this huge fish. My dad said that there aren't many fish that big in the lake, and there's no way, and that we were exaggerating how big it was. But even 10 years later I brought it up, and we both remember the exact same thing. A massive monster of a fish that did not belong in the water. I still wonder what it was, and how that monster got there.